At my 35th birthday dinner, my brother smashed a 3-tier cake directly into my face. He laughed as my head snapped back against the hardwood floor. Warm blood immediately pooled into the white vanilla frosting. My parents stood over me, holding their phones, recording the entire scene. They called it a harmless internet prank. But 12 hours later, the emergency room doctor took one look at my facial scan, locked the clinic door, and dialed 911. Because the object embedded inches from my brain was not a wooden baking dowel. It was a loaded weapon. Before I reveal how a family celebration turned into an active crime scene, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe. If you believe true, betrayal always comes from the people smiling closest to you. The private dining room at the country club smelled of expensive champagne and melted wax. I sat at the head of the table, adjusting my silk dress, enduring the obligatory toast. Julian stood holding the custom cake. He is my younger brother, a man who treats his trust fund like a career. He walked toward me, grinning. I expected him to place the dessert on the table. Instead, he accelerated. He drove the heavy fondant-covered structure directly into my face with a sharp upward thrust. The impact felt like a concrete block striking my jaw. My chair tipped backward. I hit the floor hard. A sharp tearing sensation erupted behind my right eye. I tasted sugar and copper. As I reached up to wipe the thick frosting from my vision, I felt warm liquid dripping down my cheek. It was blood. Julian doubled over, laughing. He pulled out his phone to film me struggling on the floor. My father, Gerald, chuckled, swirling the scotch in his glass. My mother, Caroline, smiled, adjusting her pearl necklace. She told me to stop being dramatic. She said it was just a viral trend and that I needed to learn how to take a joke. No one offered me a napkin. No one offered a hand to help me up. I stood on my own, pressed a cloth to my bleeding face, and left the restaurant. By sunrise, the dull ache had transformed into blinding agony. My right eye swelled shut. A rigid, localized pressure radiated deep within my sinus cavity. I drove myself to the emergency room at Memorial Hospital. Dr. Sterling handled the initial triage. He possessed the calm, practiced demeanor of a veteran physician accustomed to weekend injuries. He assumed a plastic cake dowel had snapped off and punctured my cheek. He ordered a standard cranial scan and told me to wait on the examination table. 10 minutes later, Dr. Sterling returned. His calm demeanor was gone. The color had drained from his face, leaving a sickly gray hue. He did not hold a clipboard or a prescription pad. He walked past me, secured the deadbolt on the examination room door, and pulled a heavy curtain over the glass window. He picked up the wall-mounted telephone and dialed 3 digits. He requested an immediate hazardous materials team and a police unit. I sat upright, the pain radiating through my skull. I asked him what was wrong. Dr. Sterling pointed a trembling finger at the illuminated screen on the wall. The stark black and white scan of my skull displayed a foreign object lodged deep in the orbital bone. It was not a splintered piece of wood. It was a smooth, cylindrical device. He told me wood does not glow on a radiological scan. He explained the object buried in my face was a pneumatic micro-injector. It is a specialized titanium medical device utilized for high-pressure subcutaneous delivery. The scan revealed a hairline fracture along the casing of the cylinder. The force of Julian slamming the cake into my face had cracked the titanium chamber. The device was not just lodged in my flesh. It was actively leaking an unidentified synthetic compound directly into my bloodstream. 2. The sterile air of the emergency room shifted the moment the police cruisers pulled up outside the sliding glass doors. Flashing red and blue lights reflected off the frosted windows, casting frantic, rhythmic shadows across the white tile floor. 2 uniformed officers and a plainclothes detective stepped into the corridor, moving with the grim, purposeful stride of men responding to an active, violent threat. The sharp scent of hospital-grade antiseptic mixed with the metallic tang of my own blood. My heart pounded a rapid, relentless rhythm against my ribs. The titanium injector remained firmly lodged deep within my orbital bone. The subtle burning sensation beneath my skin served as a terrifying physical reminder that an unknown chemical was currently mixing with my blood. Every single heartbeat pumped the synthetic compound deeper into my circulatory system. The detective flashed his silver shield at the nursing station, instructing the medical staff to maintain a secure, restricted perimeter around my bed. He treated my examination room like an active, contaminated crime scene. 10 minutes later, Julian marched into the triage area. He did not rush. He did not carry the frantic, desperate energy of a sibling terrified for his sister life. He wore a tailored cashmere sweater and pristine designer sneakers, projecting the arrogant aura of a man inconvenienced by a minor clerical error. The detective intercepted him before he could reach the heavy wooden door to my room. Julian crossed his arms, adopting an expression of manufactured outrage. I watched the confrontation unfold through the square observation window set into the door. My brother raised his voice, ensuring everyone in the hospital wing could hear his rehearsed theatrical defense. He claimed the entire situation was a catastrophic culinary failure. He pointed his manicured finger at the detective, arguing that the commercial bakery must have dropped a structural support rod into the batter during production. He painted himself as a victim of profound corporate negligence. He insisted he was just trying to celebrate my birthday, and now he was being interrogated over a careless mistake made by a minimum-wage pastry chef. He demanded the police redirect their resources and arrest the country club manager instead of harassing a grieving family member. He threatened to call his lawyers and bury the hospital in defamation suits if they continued to treat him like a suspect. His performance was flawless. Julian utilized the exact same manipulative tactics he had deployed since childhood to escape accountability for shattered windows and crashed vehicles. He genuinely believed his trust fund accent, his expensive clothing, and his confident posture would force the detective to back down. The detective narrowed his eyes, taking notes on a small leather pad, but he lacked the immediate physical evidence required to detain a wealthy suspect in a public hospital hallway. The tension in the corridor threatened to dissolve into a frustrating bureaucratic standoff. Julian offered a smug, condescending sigh, preparing to walk away and return to his luxury apartment. Then the heavy double doors of the emergency ward swung open. Marcus walked into the corridor. Marcus is the widower of my late older sister. He is a towering African-American man who moves with the deliberate, silent grace of an apex predator tracking its prey. Before taking over as the director of security for the hedge fund I founded, he spent 15 years hunting digital ghosts, tracking international syndicates as a senior agent in the FBI cybercrime division. He manages the physical and digital safety of a multi-billion-dollar financial portfolio. He possesses a chilling ability to dissect a lie without ever needing to raise his voice. He wore a crisp, dark suit carrying a rugged encrypted tablet tucked securely under his right arm. Marcus bypassed the hospital security guards without a single glance. He did not ask for permission to enter the restricted triage zone. He owned the space the moment his polished leather shoes touched the linoleum floor. Julian stopped talking the moment he saw Marcus approaching. The arrogant, theatrical facade faltered instantly. My brother knew Marcus did not operate on social niceties, blind family loyalty, or financial intimidation. Marcus stopped right next to the detective. He did not offer Julian a greeting. He did not offer any comforting words through the glass regarding my critical medical condition. He simply tapped the screen of his tablet, bringing the high-resolution device to life, and held it up for the detective to view. Julian scoffed, running a hand through his expensive hair, attempting to regain his lost ground. He told Marcus to put the electronic toy away and let the local authorities handle the bakery lawsuit. He tried to laugh it off, calling Marcus paranoid. Marcus ignored the insult. His deep voice carried a surgical precision that cut through the ambient noise of the beeping hospital monitors. He informed the detective that he had just concluded a remote digital sweep of the country club commercial network. The private dining room lacked surveillance to protect the privacy of wealthy guests, but the kitchen staff relied on a high-resolution cloud-based security system to monitor the food prep stations and prevent employee theft. Marcus utilized his federal background to bypass their commercial firewall and extract the archived footage from the previous evening. He pressed play on the tablet. The screen illuminated, displaying a crystal-clear overhead view of the country club pastry kitchen. The timestamp in the lower corner matched the exact moment the waitstaff left the 3-tier cake resting on the stainless steel prep counter. The footage showed Julian slipping through the swinging doors. The kitchen was entirely empty. Julian looked over his shoulder, verifying he was alone in the room. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. He did not pull out a phone to check his messages. He withdrew the cylindrical titanium micro-injector. The high-definition camera captured the cold, calculated focus settling over his features. The warm, charismatic smile he wore for the party guests vanished, replaced by the sterile concentration of a professional assassin. Julian positioned his hands directly over the center of the top tier. He drove the metal device deep into the vanilla frosting, bearing it out of sight. He carefully smoothed the icing over the entry point, hiding his lethal trap with precise, measured strokes, ensuring the surface looked perfectly untouched. The video ended with Julian picking up the heavy cake, wiping his hands on a linen towel, and walking backward through the doors, heading straight for our dining table. The detective stared at the frozen frame on the tablet. The lie evaporated instantly. The narrative of a careless baker crumbled into dust, replaced by undeniable digital proof of premeditated harm. Julian took a slow, staggering step backward. His eyes darted toward the exit, calculating the distance to the sliding glass doors. He realized his family wealth could not erase high-definition video evidence extracted by a former federal agent. He never made it to the exit. The detective dropped his leather notepad and lunged forward. He grabbed Julian by the shoulder, spinning him around with brutal force and driving his chest hard against the nearest drywall. The sharp metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs echoed down the quiet hospital corridor, cutting through the silence. The officer read him his rights, his voice echoing with unyielding authority, informing my brother he was under immediate arrest for aggravated battery with a deadly weapon. The charge carried a mandatory prison sentence. But as the officers hauled him away from the wall, Julian did not panic. He did not shed a tear or beg for forgiveness. He looked through the glass window of my room, locking his cold eyes with mine, while the mysterious chemical continued to burn through my veins. He tilted his head and offered a slow, chilling smirk. He possessed zero fear of a jail cell. He knew Gerald and Caroline were already on their way, with enough liquid capital to post his bail before the morning sun even cleared the horizon. The surgical team worked for 3 agonizing hours to stabilize the titanium cylinder lodged inside my skull, taking extreme care not to sever the optic nerve. I now lay in the intensive care unit, hooked to a terrifying array of intravenous drips designed to flush the unknown synthetic compound from my bloodstream. The rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor provided the only sound in the sterile room. My right eye was hidden beneath layers of heavy gauze. My vision in the left remained blurred, a lingering side effect of the chemical agent coursing through my system. Every breath sent a sharp spike of pain radiating down my neck. I needed rest. I needed medical isolation. Instead, I received visitors. The heavy glass door slid open, defying the strict access protocols of the critical care ward. Money opens doors even in a hospital wing guarded by nurses. Gerald and Caroline walked into my room. Julian followed close behind them. He did not wear a county prison uniform. He wore the exact same tailored cashmere sweater and pristine designer sneakers from the birthday dinner, looking refreshed and untouched. The local magistrate had processed his bail in record time. My parents had leveraged their extensive social network and deep pockets to pull a judge out of bed, securing his release before dawn. They did not approach my bed with concern. Caroline did not ask about the bandage covering half my face, or the terrifying medical equipment pumping fluids into my arms. She stood at the foot of the mattress, clutching her rare leather handbag, projecting a look of profound annoyance. Gerald took a position near the window, blocking the morning light. He adjusted his silk tie, carrying the arrogant posture of a patriarch accustomed to unconditional obedience. Gerald bypassed the pleasantries entirely. He told me the criminal charges against his son were a severe embarrassment to the family name. He called the arrest a public relations disaster that threatened his position on multiple philanthropic boards across the state. He demanded I contact the district attorney immediately and recant my statement. He wanted me to claim the police coerced my testimony while I was under the influence of heavy hospital sedatives. He instructed me to sign a document stating the entire event was a harmless accident. I stared at him, my single unbandaged eye locked onto his face. I refused to speak. The silence in the room stretched, becoming thick and suffocating. Gerald interpreted my silence as defiance. He stepped closer to the bed, dropping the thin facade of a concerned father. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a thick legal document stamped with a state seal. He informed me that if I refused to drop the criminal charges, he would file an emergency petition in the state Supreme Court by noon. The petition sought a medical conservatorship. He planned to weaponize my head injury. He intended to claim the blunt force trauma and the subsequent concussion rendered me mentally unfit to govern my own financial affairs. A conservatorship was not about my health or my recovery. It was a hostile takeover. I manage a hedge fund holding over $4 billion in managed assets. I built the portfolio from the ground up, relying on ruthless algorithmic trading and distressed asset acquisitions. Gerald wanted the keys to the kingdom. If a judge granted him temporary guardianship, he would gain unmitigated access to the corporate accounts. He could liquidate my shares, drain the capital reserves, and fund their lavish lifestyle indefinitely, all under the legal guise of protecting his injured daughter. Caroline stepped forward, reinforcing the threat. She told me the medical records indicating a traumatic brain injury were all the leverage they needed. She reminded me of their long-standing intellectual pedigree, their connections to state senators, and their weekend golf games with appellate judges. They believed their pristine aristocratic reputation would easily convince a court that I was a paranoid, delusional woman trying to frame her own innocent brother over a simple birthday accident. They intended to paint me as the villain in my own assassination attempt. Julian leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. He offered that same chilling smirk he wore at the country club. He felt invincible, standing behind the formidable shield of our parents' wealth. He thought he had outsmarted me. He believed the threat of losing my life work would force me into total submission. Arguing with individuals who view you as a financial resource is a waste of oxygen. Raising my voice would only spike my heart rate and validate their narrative of emotional instability. I did not shed a tear. I did not plead for my company or remind them of the titanium weapon their son had buried in my face just hours prior. I needed to demonstrate a power they could not counter in a courtroom or a country club lounge. I reached across the crisp hospital sheets with my uninjured hand. I picked up the plastic television remote resting on the bedside table. I pointed the device at the large flat screen mounted on the wall opposite my bed. I bypassed the standard cable channels and the local morning news broadcasts. I navigated to a secure encrypted financial terminal feed linked directly to my hedge fund trading floor. The screen illuminated the sterile room, casting a pale blue glow over their expectant faces. The terminal displayed a live press release rolling across the digital ticker. The headline detailed a major overnight corporate acquisition. Gerald frowned, squinting at the screen. He read the text aloud, his confident tone faltering halfway through the sentence. The broadcast confirmed my corporate entity had just finalized the purchase of a vast, distressed debt portfolio. We bought the assets for pennies on the dollar from a highly exclusive boutique private bank in Manhattan. It was not a random financial maneuver. It was a targeted surgical strike. I lowered the remote, resting my hand back on the white sheets. I looked at my father, watching the realization slowly unravel his aristocratic posture. That specific boutique bank was the sole financial institution holding his entire existence together. Gerald projected immense wealth, but he lived entirely on revolving credit. He had over-leveraged the family estate to fund his risky startup investments. He had taken out a third mortgage on the Fairfield property. The luxury vehicles, the country club memberships, the exclusive credit cards Caroline used to purchase her designer handbags, they were all financed through a complex web of high-interest loans held by that single bank. The bank considered his debt toxic. They wanted it off their ledgers. So my hedge fund bought it. I did not need to raise my voice to deliver the execution order. I kept my tone clinical and hollow, stripping away any trace of familial affection. I explained the mechanics of the acquisition to the 3 people standing in my room. I told Gerald that I now owned his mortgages. I owned the titles to his vehicles. I controlled the credit lines funding his daily existence. The private bank was no longer his creditor. Caroline lost the color in her cheeks. Her grip on her expensive handbag loosened, causing the leather to slip from her fingers and hit the floor with a dull thud. Julian stopped smirking, his arms dropping to his sides as the reality of the situation fractured his manufactured invincibility. They had walked into an intensive care unit to threaten my billion-dollar empire. They had not realized I had already purchased their entire reality while they were busy paying a bail bondsman. I looked at the digital clock on the cardiac monitor, tracking the precise seconds ticking by. I turned my head, locking my unbandaged eye onto my father. "You can turn around and leave this hospital room right now," I stated my voice, a cold, steady whisper slicing through the hum of the medical machinery. "Or the electronic gate keycards to your estate will be permanently deactivated in exactly 3 minutes." The threat of total financial ruin cleared the intensive care unit faster than any hospital security detail could have managed. Gerald, Caroline, and Julian did not say another word. The aristocratic arrogance they carried into the room evaporated, leaving behind the hollow panic of debtors who had just met their collector. They turned and walked out the heavy glass door, sliding shut behind them. The silence returned to the sterile space punctuated only by the steady, rhythmic beep of my cardiac monitor. My heart rate began to stabilize. I closed my single functioning eye, attempting to block out the harsh fluorescent light and the lingering sting of the unknown chemical circulating in my veins. The quiet sanctuary lasted less than 20 minutes. The sliding glass door opened again. I expected to see a triage nurse carrying a fresh bag of saline, or perhaps the plainclothes detective returning to take my formal statement. Instead, a different kind of predator walked into the room. Preston. My fiancé moved with the polished, frictionless glide of a corporate executive. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, a silk tie, and a platinum watch that cost more than a standard mortgage. He carried himself with an aura of engineered perfection, a man who spent his life curating his public image down to the precise angle of his smile. We had been engaged for 8 months. I chose him because he understood the grueling demands of the financial sector. I believed we shared a mutual ambition. But as he approached my hospital bed, the carefully constructed illusion of a loving partner shattered. Preston did not come alone. He was flanked by 3 men wearing unmarked black surgical scrubs. They did not look like standard hospital staff. They lacked identification badges and carried sleek aluminum medical transit cases instead of standard clipboards. They moved with a rigid, disciplined efficiency, positioning themselves around the edges of the room like a tactical extraction team. Preston walked to the side of my bed. He reached out and placed his hand over mine. His skin felt unnaturally cold. He looked down at the heavy gauze covering my right eye and the bruising spreading across my jawline. He furrowed his brow, projecting a masterclass in manufactured concern. He leaned in close, ensuring his voice carried a tone of breathless panic. He told me the public hospital was entirely unequipped to handle a delicate facial trauma of this magnitude. He claimed the local surgeons lacked the specialized skill to extract the foreign object without causing permanent nerve damage. He squeezed my hand, telling me he had arranged for an immediate transfer to a private surgical institute in the Upper East Side. He promised his personal team of elite specialists would take over my care and ensure a flawless recovery. I did not squeeze his hand back. I stared at him, mapping the subtle micro-expressions on his face. The panic in his voice did not reach his eyes. His gaze remained sterile, calculating, and devoid of actual empathy. I understood the strategy instantly. It was a brilliant, terrifying pivot. Julian had failed to kill me at the birthday dinner. The titanium micro-injector remained lodged in my skull, acting as an undeniable piece of physical evidence linking the attack to a premeditated plot. If the police forensic team extracted that cylinder, they would trace the chemical compound and uncover the entire conspiracy. Preston needed that evidence destroyed before the authorities could catalog it. He did not want to transfer me to a private clinic to save my vision. He wanted to transfer me into an environment he controlled. He intended to place me under heavy anesthesia in an unregulated operating room. Once I was unconscious, the black-clad surgeons would extract the titanium weapon and incinerate it. Then my heart would conveniently stop on the operating table. It would be classified as a tragic, unforeseen surgical complication, a clean clinical execution disguised as a medical accident. Dr. Sterling stepped away from the central monitoring station and approached the bed. He held up a hand signaling the private medical team to halt their advance. He informed Preston that I was a critical patient involved in an active criminal investigation. He stated that hospital protocol strictly prohibited the transfer of a patient in my fragile condition, especially when physical evidence was still embedded in the trauma site. Preston did not argue. He reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit jacket and withdrew a crisp legal document. It was printed on heavy bond paper and bore a raised golden notary seal. He handed it directly to the physician. Preston smoothed his tie and adjusted his posture. He informed Dr. Sterling that the document was a durable medical proxy. It granted him absolute legal authority to make all healthcare and surgical decisions on my behalf in the event of incapacitation. He argued that the severe head trauma and the heavy sedatives rendered me unfit to dictate my own medical care. He pointed at the notary stamp warning the doctor that interfering with a legally binding medical directive would result in a career-ending malpractice lawsuit and immediate termination. Dr. Sterling took the document. He scanned the legal phrasing, his professional confidence faltering. The paperwork appeared flawless. The dates aligned. The signatures were verified. A hospital relies on rigid liability structures, and a valid medical power of attorney overrides a standard physician assessment. Dr. Sterling looked at me, his expression caught between ethical duty and legal obligation. He slowly lowered the document, taking a hesitant step back from the bed. The three men in black scrubs moved forward in unison. One of them unlocked the wheels on my hospital bed, while another reached for the primary intravenous line, preparing to disconnect me from the hospital monitors and attach me to their portable transit equipment. I tried to speak to command them to stop, but the swelling in my jaw and the thick gauze restricted my movement. The trap was closing. Preston offered a faint chilling smile, confident he had secured the extraction. The heavy glass door did not slide open. It was shoved backward with enough force to rattle the metal tracks. Marcus stepped into the room. My brother-in-law surveyed the scene in a fraction of a second. He processed the unlocked bed wheels, the disconnected monitor cables, and the polished legal document resting in the hands of the hesitating doctor. Marcus did not yell. He did not waste breath demanding an explanation. He moved with the terrifying speed of a man who had spent a decade neutralizing hostile threats. He positioned his broad frame directly in the center of the doorway, blocking the only exit. He reached beneath the lapel of his tailored suit. He did not withdraw a pen or a mobile phone. He drew a matte black tactical stun gun. Marcus leveled the device toward the floor and pressed the activation switch. A sharp, violent crack of raw electricity ripped through the sterile air, throwing a bright blue arc across the metal prongs. The sound was deafening, echoing off the tile walls and freezing every single person in the room. The men in black scrubs stopped moving, instantly, stepping away from my bed and raising their hands in a gesture of submission. Preston staggered backward, his eyes wide with sudden, genuine fear. He pointed a trembling finger at Marcus, demanding he step aside. He shouted that he held the medical proxy and possessed the legal right to transport his fiancé. He threatened to have Marcus arrested for armed assault and kidnapping. Marcus let the electric arc dissipate. He slid the tactical weapon back into his shoulder holster. His expression remained entirely impassive, a mask of cold federal authority. He walked toward Preston, bypassing the private surgeons as if they were nothing more than minor obstacles. Marcus reached into his own coat pocket and retrieved a folded piece of paper. It did not have a standard notary seal. It carried the heavy watermarked crest of a federal judge. Marcus handed the document to Dr. Sterling, instructing him to read the top paragraph aloud. The doctor adjusted his glasses, his voice steadying as he read the federal mandate. The document was an emergency legal injunction. Marcus turned his gaze toward Preston, delivering the final devastating blow. He explained that a medical proxy is only valid if it remains the most recent active legal directive. 6 months ago, I initiated a comprehensive security audit of my personal and corporate vulnerabilities. During that audit, I discovered subtle financial irregularities, linking Preston to offshore shell companies. I did not confront him immediately. I quietly restructured my legal framework. I visited a federal magistrate and secretly transferred my medical and legal power of attorney directly to Marcus. Preston stared at the paper in the doctor's hands, the color draining from his face. The polished executive facade crumbled, leaving a desperate, cornered man. The legal shield he relied on to orchestrate my murder had been legally voided half a year before he even planned the attack. Marcus did not give Preston time to formulate a new lie. He raised his hand and signaled toward the hallway. The plainclothes detective and 3 uniformed officers stepped into the room. They bypassed Preston and moved directly toward the 3 men in black scrubs. The officers ordered the private medical team to drop their aluminum cases and place their hands against the wall. Marcus looked at Preston, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. He informed my fiancé that attempting to move a critical patient to destroy a murder weapon crosses the line from a domestic dispute into a severe felony. The police were not just asking the private medical team to leave the premises. They were placing them under immediate arrest for conspiracy to tamper with criminal evidence. The officers secured the handcuffs around the wrists of the fake surgeons, reading them their rights as they marched them out of the intensive care unit. Preston stood alone in the center of the room. His elite extraction team dismantled his legal authority, evaporated, and his involvement in the assassination attempt exposed to the authorities. The sterile fluorescent lights of the downtown police precinct hummed a low, relentless frequency. 2 hours after the confrontation in my hospital room, Preston sat in a windowless interrogation chamber. He was no longer projecting the aura of a confident corporate savior. He sat rigidly in a metal chair, his tailored charcoal suit contrasting sharply against the scuffed linoleum floor. Across the steel table sat his high-priced defense attorney, a man who charged $1,000 an hour to weave plausible deniability out of thin air. The lead detective leaned against the cinder-block wall, listening to the lawyer spin a masterpiece of legal fiction. The attorney insisted his client was a victim of emotional trauma. He argued that Preston witnessed his future wife suffer a severe facial injury and acted out of pure panic. According to the lawyer, hiring a private medical extraction team was a misguided but well-intentioned attempt to secure superior health care. He demanded the detective release Preston, immediately claiming there was zero physical evidence tying the tech executive to Julian and the poisoned cake. He painted Preston as a devoted partner whose only crime was loving me too much. The detective crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. The narrative was thin, but without hard evidence, linking Preston to the initial attack. Detaining a wealthy executive on suspicion alone was a bureaucratic minefield. The lawyer checked his gold watch, preparing to stand up and walk his client out the door. The heavy metal door of the interrogation room clicked open. Marcus walked in. He did not ask the detective for permission to enter. He carried a thick, leather-bound financial dossier tucked under his arm. He bypassed the detective and walked straight to the steel table. Marcus did not carry the frustrated energy of a local cop. He carried the clinical, calculated presence of a man who spent his career dismantling international syndicates. He dropped the heavy dossier onto the center of the table. The sharp thud echoed off the concrete walls, silencing the defense attorney mid-sentence. Marcus pulled up a metal chair and sat directly across from Preston. He rested his hands on the leather binder. He told the attorney to save the passionate soliloquy for a jury that might actually care. He stated that panic is a spontaneous, chaotic emotion. Panic results in frantic phone calls to paramedics or reckless speeding toward an emergency room. Marcus leaned forward, locking his dark eyes onto Preston. He explained that hiring a black market surgical team, outfitting them in unmarked scrubs, and drafting a forged medical proxy weeks in advance does not represent panic. It represents a calculated contingency plan. The defense attorney frowned, shifting in his seat. He demanded to know who Marcus was and what authority he had to interrupt a formal police interview. The detective stepped away from the wall, informing the lawyer that Marcus was acting as a sworn technical consultant for the department courtesy of his former federal credentials. The detective instructed the lawyer to sit down and listen. Marcus opened the thick dossier. He bypassed the medical reports and the police statements, flipping directly to a section filled with dense financial ledgers and corporate routing numbers. He explained that violent crimes within wealthy families rarely stem from simple jealousy or sudden emotional outbursts. When people who wear custom suits and drive imported sports cars commit murder, they do it for a specific return on investment. He slid a printed document across the steel table, pushing it toward Preston. Marcus dissected the paper trail with surgical precision. He explained that tracing the origin of the private surgical team led him down a deep, digital rabbit hole. The men in black scrubs were paid via an untraceable offshore wire transfer. But digital money always leaves a footprint if you know how to read the code. Marcus tracked the routing numbers back through a labyrinth of encrypted servers until he isolated the origin point. The funds originated from a corporate shell company, registered in Delaware. The entity was named Apex Holdings, LLC. Delaware is notorious for its corporate secrecy laws, allowing business owners to hide their true identities behind layers of legal anonymity. But Marcus had spent a decade breaking corporate firewalls for the FBI. He cracked the shell. He pointed a steady finger at the document resting in front of Preston. He revealed that Apex Holdings listed 2 primary executive officers. The registered managing director was Preston. The secondary beneficiary was Julian. Preston stopped adjusting his silk tie. His breathing grew shallow. He stared at the corporate registration form, his engineered perfection beginning to fracture. The defense attorney cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the narrative. He argued that his client owning a holding company with his future brother-in-law was not a crime. Wealthy individuals frequently form joint ventures for real estate investments or tax mitigation. He insisted the corporate entity proved nothing about an assassination attempt. Marcus offered a slow, chilling smile. He agreed that forming a shell company is standard business practice. It was the specific asset purchased by the holding company that elevated the situation from a joint venture to premeditated murder. Marcus turned the page in his dossier, revealing a highly detailed insurance contract. The document bore the distinct logo of a premier global underwriting firm. He explained the mechanics of the contract to the silent room. When a hedge fund manages billions of dollars, the stability of the entire enterprise rests on the shoulders of its founder. To mitigate the risk of sudden market collapse in the event of an unexpected tragedy, corporate boards often take out specialized insurance policies on their chief executives. It is known in the financial sector as key person insurance. Marcus slid the insurance contract across the table, placing it directly over the Delaware registration form. He revealed that 3 months ago, Apex Holdings quietly purchased a key person insurance policy. But the policy was not designed to protect the hedge fund or its investors. The policy was structured to pay out directly to the Delaware shell company. The insured asset listed on the contract was my life. The defense attorney stared at the document, the color draining from his face. He read the bold numbers printed on the coverage line. $50 million. Marcus leaned back in his metal chair, watching the realization crush Preston. That was the exact price tag they placed on my existence. Julian did not smash the cake into my face as a bizarre prank. It was a localized, highly coordinated assassination attempt. The titanium micro-injector was designed to deliver a lethal dose of a synthetic peptide, causing an immediate fatal heart attack. The death would look like a tragic, unexpected medical anomaly. An allergic reaction or a sudden cardiac event. The coroner would rule it accidental. The hedge fund would mourn its founder, and Preston, alongside Julian, would submit a quiet claim to the underwriting firm walking away with $50 million in untaxed liquid capital. But the titanium cylinder fractured on impact. The chemical leaked slowly, instead of delivering the fatal payload instantly. I survived the night. I walked into the emergency room with the murder weapon still embedded in my facial structure. If the hospital surgeons extracted the device, the police would trace the peptide, and the entire insurance conspiracy would unravel. That was why Preston arrived at the intensive care unit with a fake medical proxy and a private extraction team. He needed to secure the murder weapon and ensure I died on his operating table to finalize the insurance claim. Preston sat paralyzed, his eyes locked onto the $50 million figure. He realized his impenetrable financial fortress had just become a glass cage. The defense attorney swallowed hard, looking at the detective. He tried to pivot, arguing that even if the insurance policy existed, forging a signature for a financial payout was a white-collar state-level offense. He claimed it was a matter for civil litigation, not a homicide unit. Marcus closed the heavy leather dossier. The sharp thud echoed in the silent room, signaling the end of the negotiation. He corrected the lawyer, ensuring his voice carried the unyielding weight of federal law. Purchasing a fraudulent insurance policy requires the electronic transmission of forged signatures, falsified medical records, and illegal wire transfers across state lines. The moment Preston routed the initial premium payment from New York to the underwriter in Delaware, the crime transcended local jurisdiction. Marcus stood up from the steel table, towering over the disgraced executive. He informed Preston that manipulating interstate commerce to fund a premeditated assassination is classified as federal wire fraud. The local police were no longer driving the investigation. The financial dossier had already been transmitted to the United States Department of Justice. Preston was no longer facing a local assault charge. He was staring down the barrel of a federal indictment that carried a mandatory sentence of decades in a maximum security penitentiary. The silence inside the interrogation room hung heavy and suffocating, following the revelation of the $50 million insurance policy. Preston stared at the corporate registration documents, his pristine executive posture crumbling under the weight of federal wire fraud charges. The high-priced defense attorney sat rigid, his mind calculating the irreversible damage to his client. He was preparing to advise Preston to invoke his right to remain silent when a sharp rhythmic vibration disrupted the quiet space. The sound originated from the inner pocket of Marcus' tailored suit jacket. He reached inside and withdrew a sleek encrypted smartphone. The screen illuminated, displaying a secure priority notification from the Federal Bureau of Investigation Quantitative Analysis Unit based in Quantico. Marcus did not ask for privacy. He tapped the screen authorizing the biometric scan and opened the classified forensic report right in front of the local detective. While I lay in the intensive care unit battling the terrifying effects of the unknown chemical, the federal laboratory had been working frantically to isolate the compound. The surgical team had successfully extracted the fractured titanium micro-injector from my orbital bone earlier that morning. They placed the device in a sterile biohazard containment transport and handed it directly to a waiting federal courier. The technicians at Quantico possessed the most advanced spectrometric equipment on the East Coast. It took them less than 3 hours to break down the molecular structure of the weapon. Marcus read the scrolling text, his dark eyes narrowing as the true scale of the assassination plot materialized on the glowing screen. He placed the phone flat on the steel table, ensuring Preston could see the official federal seal pulsing at the top of the document. Marcus began to translate the dense chemical analysis for the silent room. He explained that the fluid leaking from the fractured cylinder was not a common poison. It was not cyanide arsenic or a street-level narcotic procured from a dark web syndicate. Those substances are chaotic. They leave distinct chemical markers in the liver and blood tissue, making them easily detectable during a standard autopsy. The architects of this murder plot needed a weapon that would vanish without a trace. The substance isolated by the federal laboratory was a highly engineered synthetic peptide. Marcus detailed the lethality of the compound with chilling clinical precision. The peptide was a microscopic chain of amino acids, specifically structured to bypass the natural filtration systems of the human body. Once introduced into the bloodstream, it was programmed to travel directly to the cardiovascular system and bind to the receptors in the heart muscle. The chemical reaction forces the heart into sudden, irreversible, acute failure. It induces a massive, catastrophic myocardial infarction within seconds of delivery. But the true terror of the synthetic peptide was not its lethality. It was its degradation rate. Marcus leaned forward, locking his gaze onto Preston. He explained that within 30 minutes of triggering the fatal heart attack, the peptide is designed to dissolve entirely. It breaks down into natural, harmless proteins that already exist within the human body. If the assassination had gone according to plan, a county medical examiner would have placed my body on an autopsy table, run a standard toxicology panel, and found absolutely nothing. They would have ruled the death a tragic, spontaneous cardiac anomaly. Julian and Preston would have buried me, collected the $50 million insurance payout, and walked away clean. The defense attorney wiped a thin layer of sweat from his forehead. The conversation had shifted from white-collar financial fraud to a sophisticated biochemical homicide. Marcus tapped the screen of his phone, scrolling down to the secondary forensic report. He turned his attention to the delivery mechanism, the titanium micro-injector. The original plan relied on the precision of the device. Julian was supposed to strike me with the cake, applying just enough pressure to trigger the pneumatic piston inside the cylinder. The piston would fire the peptide through the dermal layers of my skin in a fraction of a millisecond. The tiny entry wound would be disguised by the sticky frosting and later dismissed as a minor scrape from my fall. But Julian is a reckless, arrogant amateur. He lacked the disciplined control of a professional killer. He drove the cake into my face with far too much force, causing the titanium chamber to strike my orbital bone at a severe angle. The impact fractured the internal casing, jamming the pneumatic piston. Instead of a lethal, instantaneous injection, the crack caused the peptide to leak slowly into my surrounding tissue. That structural failure saved my life and preserved the murder weapon. Marcus revealed the final detail of the FBI report. Federal technicians did not just analyze the chemical compound. They placed the fractured titanium cylinder under a scanning electron microscope. While the exterior of the device was polished smooth to avoid identification, the interior threading held a secret. Hidden along the microscopic grooves, invisible to the naked eye, was a laser-etched proprietary barcode. It was a standard manufacturing protocol designed to track high-value prototype equipment. Marcus initiated a live query on his device, mirroring his screen to a larger monitor on the interrogation room wall. He routed the alphanumeric barcode through the Federal Registry of Patented Medical Devices. The system churned through thousands of corporate patents, scanning clinical trial databases and private laboratory inventories. The digital search bar flashed green. The match appeared on the screen, illuminating the windowless room. The serial number did not belong to a black market arms dealer or a foreign military contractor. It belonged to the Research and Development Division of Vanguard Therapeutics. Vanguard Therapeutics is a premier biotechnology firm headquartered in Boston. They specialize in cutting-edge cardiovascular research, developing experimental treatments for severe heart conditions. They manage billions of dollars in clinical trial funding and boast one of the most secure private laboratory facilities in the country. And Preston, sitting frozen in the metal chair, was the chief executive officer. The illusion of the panicked, devoted fiancé shattered permanently. Marcus stood up, towering over the steel table. He did not yell. He delivered the facts with a steady, unyielding cadence that left zero room for negotiation. Julian did not source the synthetic peptide. Marcus stated, his voice cutting through the sterile air. Julian does not possess the intellectual capacity or the underworld connections to acquire a dissolving biochemical weapon. You sourced it, say it. You utilized your executive clearance to bypass your own corporate security protocols. You walked into the restricted research wing of Vanguard Therapeutics and signed out a classified pneumatic prototype. You filled that prototype with an unapproved experimental peptide designed by your own scientists. You placed a lethal, untraceable bioweapon into the hands of a volatile trust fund kid and sent him to a family birthday dinner. Preston opened his mouth, but his vocal cords failed to produce a single sound. The undeniable physical evidence linked him directly to the point of origin. He had weaponized his own corporate research to execute his future wife. The defense attorney did not attempt to mount a counterargument. The man who charged $1,000 an hour to defend wealthy executives recognized a legal point of no return. He snapped his leather briefcase shut. He stood up, looking down at his client with a mixture of professional dread and profound disgust. The attorney stated clearly for the audio recording that he was immediately recusing himself from the case, citing an irreconcilable ethical conflict. He turned and walked out of the interrogation room, abandoning Preston to the federal authorities. The local detective stepped away from the cinder block wall, his hand resting instinctively on his utility belt. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from a standard homicide investigation into a national security protocol. Marcus placed his hands on the steel table, leaning in close to Preston. He explained the final legal reality of the situation. Stealing a prototype from a corporate laboratory is industrial espionage, Marcus explained. Falsifying an insurance claim is wire fraud. But the chemical you chose to put inside that injector changes the entire paradigm of this investigation. That synthetic peptide is not approved by the Food and Drug Administration. It is an unregistered experimental biological agent. Preston began to tremble. His tailored charcoal suit felt like a straitjacket. Deploying an unregistered biological agent outside a secure laboratory setting with the explicit intent to inflict civilian casualties triggers an automatic federal tripwire. Marcus continued, his voice turning cold and absolute. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is no longer the primary agency managing your case. 30 minutes ago, the director of the FBI briefed the executive branch. The Department of Homeland Security has officially assumed total jurisdiction over this precinct. Marcus turned toward the heavy metal door, just as heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. You are not facing a simple murder charge, Preston Marcus concluded, stepping back to allow the door to open. By stealing an experimental peptide and orchestrating its deployment in a public civilian space, you have elevated a domestic assassination attempt into a formal act of bioterrorism. The arrest of a prominent biotech executive on domestic bioterrorism charges sent immediate shockwaves through the Eastern Seaboard financial sector. The media scrambled to uncover the details of the failed assassination. Gerald and Caroline recognized the closing walls. Their pristine societal armor was fracturing. Their future son-in-law was locked inside a federal holding facility. Their biological son was facing decades in a maximum security penitentiary. The untaxed offshore money they expected to inherit from my engineered death was gone. They needed a new strategy to survive the fallout. They needed to force my hand to drop the civil and criminal complaints so they could extract whatever capital remained in my accounts before the federal indictments swept them up as co-conspirators. They did not hire defense attorneys. They hired a black operations public relations firm based in Washington. These were the crisis managers who specialized in destroying reputations to protect elite clients. They weaponized public perception. Within 24 hours, the narrative shifted. My secure tablet began flooding with alerts from major tabloid networks, financial blogs, and coordinated social media campaigns. The headlines did not mention titanium micro-injectors or synthetic peptides. The crisis firm buried the biochemical reality under a mountain of sensationalized fiction. They painted a vastly different picture. They called me a ruthless, cold-blooded corporate tyrant. The public relations firm spun a masterful fiction, relying on the classic trope of the unhinged billionaire. They cited anonymous hospital staff and fabricated witness testimonies. They claimed I was heavily intoxicated at the country club birthday dinner. They reported that I stumbled in a drunken rage and fell face first into the cake, sustaining a self-inflicted injury. The articles alleged that I was leveraging my billion-dollar hedge fund to bribe local law enforcement and frame my innocent brother out of pure spite. They painted Preston as a tragic figure, A devoted fiancé caught in the crossfire of my vindictive paranoia, arrested solely because he tried to secure better medical care for a deranged partner. The narrative resonated with an American public already primed to distrust wealthy corporate elites. The court of public opinion is a volatile arena. The social media backlash was swift and relentless. Protesters began gathering outside my corporate headquarters in Manhattan, holding signs demanding a federal investigation into my business practices. News vans parked outside the hospital, hoping to catch a glimpse of the villainous CEO. The true damage materialized on the trading floor. The stock valuation of my hedge fund began to waver. Institutional investors hate unpredictable press. The board of directors scheduled an emergency conference call. Several senior partners suggested I step down from my position as chief executive officer and take an indefinite leave of absence to stop the capital bleed. Gerald and Caroline were executing a textbook extortion play. They were burning my reputation to the ground, hoping the smoke would suffocate my logic and force a quiet financial settlement. They expected me to panic to draft a tearful public apology or hire a competing public relations firm to argue my case in the tabloids. I sat in my secure recovery suite, monitoring the dipping stock ticker on my screen. The bruising on my face was fading, but the cold resolve in my chest had hardened into diamond. Arguing with a smear campaign only validates the premise. Acknowledging a lie gives it oxygen. I did not call the board of directors to beg for my job. I picked up my phone and dialed a single secure number. Marcus answered on the first ring. I told him the public theater had reached its peak. The audience was watching. I authorized him to initiate the counter protocol. That evening, Gerald secured a primetime interview on a leading national financial news network. He intended to deliver the final killing blow to my corporate standing. He wore a modest gray suit, abandoning his usual flashy silk ties and luxury watches to project the image of a humble, heartbroken father. He sat under the bright studio lights across from a veteran financial anchor. The expansive digital screens behind him displayed a soft, generic graphic of the Wall Street skyline. Gerald looked directly into the camera, his eyes shining with manufactured tears. He fed the anchor a rehearsed monologue, hitting every emotional trigger the PR firm had scripted for him. He spoke about the profound pain of watching his daughter lose her humanity to corporate greed. He claimed my relentless pursuit of wealth had eroded my sanity, resulting in a tragic drunken accident that I was now blaming on his innocent son. He begged me on live television to seek psychiatric help. He pleaded for me to drop the baseless criminal charges and return to the family that truly loved him. It was a flawless performance designed to corner me in front of millions of viewers, turning me into a monster on national television. He did not get the chance to finish his closing statement. The expansive digital backdrop behind the anchor desk flickered. The generic skyline vanished. The live network feed was not interrupted by a commercial break or a technical glitch. It was hijacked from the inside. Marcus had deployed his former Federal Cyber Division contacts to bypass the studio broadcast relay, injecting an external data stream directly into the live feed. The screen illuminated with raw financial data. Rows of pristine, high-definition spreadsheets scrolled across the broadcast, replacing the manufactured tiers with cold, hard mathematics. The veteran anchor turned around in his leather chair, his earpiece buzzing as the control room scrambled to cut the feed. Gerald stopped speaking. He looked over his shoulder at the towering digital screen, and his jaw went slack. The documents displayed on national television were offshore banking ledgers. They were certified account statements, originating from shell banks in the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands. The headers bore the unmistakable watermarks of anonymous corporate holding companies. But Marcus had decrypted the ownership tiers before uploading the files. The beneficiary names were no longer hidden behind legal anonymity. The names Gerald and Caroline flashed in bold red text next to every single international routing number. The anchor recognized the significance of the scrolling numbers instantly. He abandoned his scripted questions and began reading the figures aloud over the live feed. The ledgers detailed decades of systematic tax evasion. Tens of millions of dollars in untaxed liquid capital siphoned from domestic business loans, skimmed from real estate transactions, and hidden in offshore tax havens. The American public watched as the grieving father narrative dissolved into a staggering display of elite financial fraud. Gerald ripped the microphone off his lapel, standing up from his chair. He demanded the cameras be cut, pointing a trembling finger at the anchor. He shouted that the documents were forged, a desperate lie echoing in the silent studio. But his panic was undeniable. He recognized the exact account balances scrolling on the screen behind him. He knew the truth was out. My phone buzzed on the bedside table. It was a secure text message from Marcus. He informed me that the digital broadcast was not just for public entertainment. He had simultaneously transmitted the decrypted ledgers directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. Tax evasion on an 8-figure scale triggers an automatic, unyielding federal response. The IRS does not wait for a court date to secure their owed revenue. They operate with ruthless administrative efficiency. Marcus confirmed the protocol was already active. The moment those verified ledgers hit the federal database, the Department of the Treasury issued a global administrative freeze. Every domestic bank account, every investment portfolio, and every offshore trust bearing my parents' names was locked by federal mandate. Gerald stood in the middle of a live television studio, sweating under the bright lights, staring at the ruins of his pristine reputation. His attempt to manipulate public opinion had just provided the federal government with the exact coordinates of his hidden wealth. His elaborate smear campaign was dead, and his entire financial empire was officially erased. The Federal Detention Center in Lower Manhattan is a fortress of reinforced concrete and soundproof glass. Preston sat in a sterile attorney consultation room wearing a standard-issue khaki jumpsuit. The tailored charcoal suits and platinum watches were gone, replaced by the harsh reality of federal custody. A small television mounted in the corner of the room broadcasted the breaking news of Gerald and his spectacular financial collapse on live television. Preston watched the offshore ledgers scroll across the screen. He realized his powerful in-laws were now destitute targets of the Internal Revenue Service. The aristocratic alliance he relied upon to fund his legal defense had just evaporated. He needed an exit strategy. He needed untraceable liquid capital to hire a shadow legal team or arrange a discreet transport out of the country if he managed to secure bail. His new defense attorney, a junior partner from a high-priced firm, sat across the metal table scrolling through an encrypted tablet. The lawyer was reviewing a digital copy of the federal indictment. Preston leaned forward, requesting to see the screen under the guise of reviewing the legal statutes. The attorney handed the device over and turned his attention to a stack of printed affidavits. Preston did not read the indictment. His fingers moved with practiced speed across the digital keyboard. He bypassed the legal documents and accessed a secure decentralized blockchain exchange hidden within the deep web. He logged into a covert cold storage wallet he had established years ago. He initiated a blind transfer, attempting to route $5 million from a hidden Cayman trust into an anonymous cryptocurrency node. Once the digital coin cleared the blockchain ledger, the money would be virtually untraceable. He hit confirm. A small loading circle appeared on the screen, calculating the cryptographic hash. Preston exhaled a quiet breath, feeling a brief surge of arrogant triumph. He thought he had outsmarted the federal dragnet. 10 miles away in the secure server room of my Manhattan penthouse, Marcus sat illuminated by the glow of a dozen high-resolution monitors. He was running a continuous algorithmic sweep on every financial instrument connected to Preston and Julian. The system chimed a sharp low tone. Marcus leaned forward, his dark eyes scanning the cascading lines of green code. He detected the blockchain anomaly the moment Preston initiated the transfer. The Cayman Trust was already flagged by our internal security audit. Marcus did not just watch the transaction happen. He deployed a routing loop into the exchange protocol. He intercepted the digital handshake between the servers, trapping the $5 million in a cryptographic purgatory. The funds were frozen mid-transfer, permanently locked in a digital void. But Marcus found something far more valuable than the frozen capital. When the transaction failed, the decentralized exchange automatically generated a standard error log. The log bounced a carbon copy receipt to a hidden encrypted email address embedded deep in the metadata. Marcus isolated the email server. He deployed a brute force decryption key, fracturing the firewall in less than 4 minutes. He downloaded the entire inbox architecture. The emails were not standard corporate communications. They lacked the formal structure of a tech executive speaking to a financial broker. The tone was intimate, explicit, and steeped in shared criminality. Marcus Cross referenced the receiving digital signature with the corporate registry. The hidden email address belonged to Vanessa Sterling. She was the senior risk underwriter at the exact global insurance firm that had approved the $50 million policy on my life. She was not just a corrupt corporate officer. She was Preston's secret mistress. The encrypted inbox contained hundreds of messages detailing their illicit affair and their coordinated effort to bypass the mandatory medical examinations and corporate board approvals required for a life insurance policy of that magnitude. Vanessa had leveraged her senior executive clearance to push the contract through the system in exchange for a promised share of the payout and a new life abroad. Marcus picked up his phone and contacted his former colleagues at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He transmitted the decrypted inbox directly to the white-collar crime division. Night had fallen over the financial district. Vanessa sat in her corner office on the 40th floor of her corporate headquarters. She was alone, the rest of the staff having gone home hours ago. The television in her office replayed the news of the bioterrorism arrests and the financial ruin of my parents. Panic gripped her chest. She realized the assassination plot had failed and the authorities were closing in. She opened her mahogany desk drawer and pulled out a stack of original underwriting contracts, the physical documents bearing her forged approval signatures. She carried the files to a heavy-duty crosscut shredder in the corner of the room. She powered the machine on the harsh grinding noise, filling the silent office. She fed the first folder into the steel teeth, desperate to destroy the physical trail. The heavy glass doors of her executive suite shattered. 6 armed federal agents stormed into the office, tactical flashlights cutting through the dim lighting. 2 agents rushed forward, grabbing Vanessa by the shoulders and pulling her away from the machine. Another agent dropped to the floor and ripped the power cord from the wall, halting the steel teeth before they could consume the final contract. The lead agent secured her wrists in steel handcuffs, reading her the Miranda warning over her frantic protests. They seized her servers, her personal devices, and the half-shredded documents. An hour later, Vanessa sat in a harsh, windowless interrogation room at the federal building. She wore a designer pencil skirt and a silk blouse projecting a fragile facade of corporate defiance. The federal prosecutor entered the room, flanked by Marcus. They did not offer her a glass of water. They did not negotiate. The prosecutor dropped a thick file onto the table. He outlined the charges with a cold, unyielding cadence. Wire fraud. Conspiracy to commit murder. Corporate insurance fraud. He informed her that the Department of Justice was seeking a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The corporate defiance cracked. The survival instinct of a white-collar criminal is entirely transactional. When faced with the reality of spending the next 2 decades in a concrete cell, the concept of loyalty vanishes. Vanessa began to tremble, her perfectly manicured hands shaking against the steel table. She looked at the prosecutor and requested a formal proffer agreement, offering total cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence. The prosecutor nodded. Vanessa reached into her confiscated designer bag, sitting on the evidence cart near the door. She unzipped a hidden interior lining and extracted a small silver digital voice recorder. She placed the device on the table. She explained that she never truly trusted Preston. She knew men who were willing to murder their future wives would not hesitate to betray their business partners. She had recorded their private conversations in his penthouse as an insurance policy. Marcus took the recorder, returning to my secure recovery suite. I sat on the edge of my bed, the bandages on my face feeling heavy, as Marcus connected the device to a set of encrypted speakers. He pressed play. The audio filled the quiet room. Preston's voice was crisp clear and stripped of his usual public relations polish. He spoke to Vanessa in low, confident tones. He promised her $10 million from the insurance payout once my death certificate was finalized. He detailed their plans to relocate to a private estate in southern France. Then Vanessa asked a fatal question on the recording. She asked about Julian. She pointed out that my brother was reckless and unpredictable. She worried Julian would panic and demand a larger cut of the money, threatening to expose the entire operation. Preston let out a cold, clinical laugh. The sound sent a chill down my spine. He told Vanessa not to worry about my brother. He called Julian a volatile liability, a temporary tool that had outlived its usefulness. Preston detailed the final phase of his assassination protocol. He explained that once the $50 million cleared the shell company accounts, he planned to invite Julian to a celebratory weekend at a remote hunting cabin in upstate New York. Preston outlined his intention to drug Julian with a heavy cocktail of synthetic opioids. He planned to stage a fatal overdose, making it look like the crushing guilt of my accidental birthday death drove my brother to suicide. A tragic end to a grieving sibling. The police would close the file, the liability would be permanently erased, and Preston would keep the entire fortune. I stared at the speakers, processing the sheer depth of the betrayal. Preston did not just plan to murder me. He engineered a sequence to execute his own accomplice to ensure his permanent silence. Marcus did not just log the audio file into our private records. He executed a brilliant psychological strike. He forwarded the digital audio file directly to the public defender assigned to represent Julian, adding it to the standard legal discovery packet. The next morning, in a separate federal holding wing, Julian sat in his cell. His public defender slid a tablet through the secure communication slot, instructing him to review the newly acquired prosecution evidence. Julian put on the cheap plastic headphones and pressed play. He sat alone on a rigid metal cot, listening to the crisp audio of his polished, sophisticated partner laughing about his impending murder. He heard Preston call him a disposable pawn, a loose end marked for execution. The headphones slipped from his hands, clattering against the concrete floor. Julian stared at the cinder block wall, the blood draining from his face. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had risked a lifetime in prison to secure a fortune he was never meant to spend. He was a dead man walking from the very beginning. The fragile criminal alliance shattered into a million jagged pieces. Julian gripped the metal bars of his cell, his eyes burning with a sudden, ferocious hatred. He was ready to burn the entire world to the ground, as long as Preston burned with it. Midnight settled over the VIP recovery wing, bringing a deceptive layer of quiet to the sterile corridors. The chaos of the federal indictments, the seized offshore ledgers, and the fractured criminal alliances felt distant, separated from my hospital bed by layers of reinforced glass and restricted access doors. The rhythmic hum of the cardiac monitor tracked my vital signs. The swelling in my jaw had reduced slightly, but a dull, persistent ache radiated from the repaired orbital bone, reminding me of the titanium weapon Julian had buried in my face. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling tiles, processing the sheer volume of betrayal that had unraveled over the past 48 hours. Preston was detained by the Department of Homeland Security. Julian was locked in a federal holding cell, listening to the audio recordings of his partner plotting his execution. Gerald was facing the immediate wrath of the Internal Revenue Service, his aristocratic empire reduced to frozen accounts and televised humiliation. The primary threats were neutralized. The architects of the assassination plot were securely confined within the justice system. But true predators do not always wear tailored suits or boast about their schemes on encrypted emails. Sometimes, the most lethal threats hide behind the pristine facade of maternal affection. The small red indicator light on the ceiling-mounted security camera in the corner of my room flickered. It blinked twice, breaking its steady rhythm, and then faded to dark. I turned my head slowly, the movement sending a sharp spike of pain down my neck. The ambient light from the corridor outside my room shifted. The electronic locking mechanism on the heavy wooden door disengages with a soft metallic click. A localized signal jammer had bypassed the hospital digital security grid. The door pushed open. A figure stepped into the dim room. He wore standard hospital scrubs, a pale blue surgical cap, and a tight white medical mask covering the lower half of his face. He carried a small stainless steel tray, holding a few wrapped bandages and a plastic cup. To a casual observer walking past the room, he looked like a weary night shift orderly performing a routine check on a critical patient. But his posture betrayed him. He did not possess the exhausted, heavy-footed shuffle of a nurse working a 12-hour shift. He moved with a silent, frictionless grace, rolling his weight from heel to toe to eliminate any sound. His eyes above the rim of the medical mask were cold-focused and devoid of any bedside empathy. He was scanning the room, mapping the exits, and calculating the exact distance to my intravenous drip. I tensed against the crisp hospital sheets. The lingering effects of the trauma and the heavy sedatives rendered my limbs heavy and unresponsive. I could not trigger the emergency call button taped to the bed rail. I could not scream. The man approached the side of my bed, placing the steel tray on the rolling table. He did not check my chart or read my vital signs on the monitor. He reached into the deep pocket of his blue scrubs and withdrew a pre-filled medical syringe. The liquid inside the plastic barrel was dense and clear. It was not a painkiller or a standard antibiotic flush. It was a high-dose hypercoagulant. If a patient suffering from severe head trauma suddenly experiences a catastrophic blood clot, the resulting ischemic stroke is rarely questioned by the attending medical staff. It is logged as a tragic but natural complication of the initial injury. The coagulant would force my blood to thicken instantly, stopping the flow of oxygen to my brain in a matter of minutes. The coroner would find a fatal blockage in my cerebral artery. The assassination would be finalized, and the authorities would close the file without a second glance. The man uncapped the needle. He reached for the rubber injection port on my saline line, his gloved fingers moving with practiced, lethal efficiency. The sharp tip of the needle hovered mere millimeters from the flexible tubing. He never made the connection. A shadow detached itself from the dark corner of the room behind the heavy privacy curtain. Marcus had not gone home to rest. He had not trusted the hospital security detail to protect a high-value target involved in an active federal bioterrorism case. He had spent the entire night sitting in the blind spot of the room, waiting in total silence. Marcus did not shout a warning. He did not draw his tactical weapon or waste time issuing commands to a hired killer. He executed a kinetic physical strike designed to neutralize the threat instantly. He stepped forward, closing the distance in a fraction of a second. Marcus drove the heel of his palm directly into the elbow joint of the man holding the syringe. The impact shattered the structural integrity of the arm. The man let out a muffled gasp as his limb bent at an unnatural backward angle. The syringe slipped from his numb fingers, clattering harmlessly onto the linoleum floor. Before the assassin could process the pain or attempt to pivot, Marcus grabbed him by the collar of his scrubs and swept his legs. The man hit the ground hard, the air rushing from his lungs. Marcus dropped his weight onto the killer, pinning his chest to the floor with a knee, while simultaneously applying a brutal tactical torsion lock to his uninjured wrist. The sharp, sickening snap of the wrist bone echoed in the quiet room. The assassin went limp, his survival instinct overriding his assignment. Marcus held the lock, ensuring the man could not reach for a concealed weapon. He reached down with his free hand and tore the surgical mask away from the killer face. The features were unfamiliar. He was not a disgruntled former employee or a recognizable associate of Preston. He was a professional ghost, a hired shadow operating off the grid. Marcus did not bother interrogating a mercenary who was paid to keep silent. He conducted a rapid physical search of the man pockets. He bypassed a set of lockpicks and a folding knife, extracting a rugged, thick-cased smartphone. He secured the groaning assassin to the heavy metal frame of the hospital bed, utilizing a set of industrial zip ties pulled from his own tactical belt. Once the threat was immobilized, Marcus picked up the dropped syringe, placing it safely in a biohazard bag for the federal lab. Then he turned his attention to the encrypted phone. Marcus pulled a small diagnostic decryption cable from his jacket pocket, connecting the killer phone directly to his own federal-grade tablet. He sat on the edge of the rolling tray table, the pale glow of the screen illuminating his stern features. "Professional cleaners do not operate on credit." Marcus whispered his voice, a low, steady rumble in the dark room. "They do not accept wire transfers or cryptocurrency routed through shell companies. Digital money leaves a footprint. They operate strictly on physical, untraceable cash. And a job targeting a high-profile chief executive inside a secure medical facility carries a premium price tag." He bypassed the initial security firewall of the burner phone, accessing the internal communication logs. The text messages were sparse, utilizing coded language to confirm the location of my room and the timing of the hospital's security shift change. But Marcus was not interested in the text messages. He was hunting for the payment origin. He explained that the killer received a dead drop coordinate earlier that evening, a location to collect the $100,000 cash retainer required to execute the hit. Marcus isolated the internal GPS module of the burner phone, extracting the exact latitude and longitude coordinates logged during the time of the cash exchange. The location was a desolate concrete parking structure located 3 miles from the hospital. Marcus did not stop there. He opened a secure portal to the municipal traffic control network, hacking into the grid of high-resolution surveillance cameras stationed at the intersection directly outside that specific parking structure. He synced the timestamp of the cash drop with the recorded video feed. The footage buffered on the tablet screen, rendering a crisp black and white image. A sleek luxury sedan pulled into the frame, slowing down as it approached the entrance of the dark garage. The vehicle stopped. The driver's side door opened. Marcus paused the video. He zoomed in on the driver stepping out of the car, carrying a heavy leather duffel bag. He enhanced the resolution, sharpening the pixels until the face of the driver became undeniable. I stared at the tablet screen, the chill of the room settling deep into my bones. It was not Preston deploying a corporate fixer from behind bars. It was not Julian attempting a final desperate strike. The person stepping out of the luxury vehicle holding $100,000 in blood money was Caroline, my mother. She wore her signature designer trench coat, her hair perfectly styled. She did not look frantic or coerced. She moved with a cold, calculated purpose. She had watched her husband's financial empire collapse on national television. She realized the offshore accounts were frozen, and the aristocratic legacy was turning to dust. Instead of seeking legal counsel or accepting the ruin of her own making, she chose a different path. She accessed a hidden reserve of physical cash, hired a dark web assassin, and orchestrated the murder of her own daughter to secure whatever inheritance or corporate control she believed she could salvage from my death. The moral decay of the family was absolute. They had bypassed greed and descended into pure calculated evil. The woman who painted my childhood bedroom pale blue had just paid a stranger to inject poison into my veins. Marcus closed the tablet, the definitive proof of her treason, locked in the federal drive, setting the stage for the final devastating takedown of the matriarch. Federal bureaucracy often provides a temporary artificial illusion of freedom for the ultra-wealthy. While the Department of Homeland Security drafted the formal bioterrorism indictment overnight, Preston leveraged his corporate legal team to exploit a narrow procedural loophole. The presiding magistrate granted a temporary 24-hour supervised release, pending the grand jury arraignment. The judge issued the bail solely because Preston remained the acting chief executive of a publicly traded biotechnology firm, and his sudden detention threatened to destabilize a sector of the medical market. Preston walked out of the precinct wearing a concealed GPS tracking monitor beneath his tailored trousers. He knew the federal trial was inevitable. He knew his secret mistress was cooperating with the prosecution. He needed liquid capital to fund a shadow defense team and arrange a discreet transport out of the jurisdiction before the borders closed. He needed the keys to my financial empire. By sunrise, he launched his final desperate offensive. The executive boardroom on the 60th floor of my hedge fund headquarters offered a panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline. The space was a fortress of polished mahogany frosted glass and high-resolution data screens. Preston convened an emergency meeting of the board of directors before the opening bell of the stock exchange. He did not invite legal counsel or external auditors. He restricted the attendance to the 7 senior managing partners who controlled the voting shares of the corporate trust. Gerald sat to his right. My father was a drowning man clinging to a razor blade. The Internal Revenue Service had frozen his domestic and offshore accounts, leaving him destitute. He arrived at the corporate tower utilizing a borrowed car, desperate to help Preston seize control of my company. Gerald believed that if they could successfully hijack the hedge fund, they could quietly liquidate a fraction of the digital assets and flee the country together. Preston stood at the head of the long wooden table, projecting his engineered executive perfection. He wore a crisp navy suit, his posture straight, his voice modulated to convey profound synthetic grief. He pressed a button on the digital podium, illuminating the central projection screen. The display highlighted a specific section of the corporate charter, Section 4, the Incapacity Clause. Preston looked around the room, locking eyes with the nervous senior partners. The tabloid smear campaign orchestrated by my parents had already caused a significant dip in our overnight trading valuation. The partners were anxious, prioritizing profit margins over loyalty. He delivered his fabricated narrative with chilling conviction. Preston informed the board that I had suffered a catastrophic ischemic stroke during the night. He claimed the blunt force trauma from the birthday accident caused a severe blood clot in my cerebral artery. He relied entirely on the assumption that Caroline had succeeded. He believed the assassin she hired had successfully bypassed the hospital security and injected the hypercoagulant into my intravenous line. Preston told the room that I was currently lying in the intensive care unit, hooked to a mechanical ventilator in an irreversible vegetative state. Gerald lowered his head, covering his face with his hands, performing the role of the shattered, grieving father. He mumbled a rehearsed line about praying for my peaceful passing. "The market requires stability," Preston stated, his voice echoing in the quiet boardroom. "The stock price is plummeting due to the uncertainty surrounding her health. Our investors are threatening to pull their capital. According to the corporate bylaws, the board possesses the authority to invoke the Incapacity Clause and install an acting chief executive to prevent a total financial collapse. As her fiancé and primary beneficiary, I am stepping forward to assume total operational control of the fund." A heavy silence settled over the mahogany table. The senior partners exchanged uneasy glances. They were ruthless financial operators, but the sudden transition of power felt rushed. Yet the prospect of losing millions in market valuation terrified them more than corporate loyalty. The lead voting partner nodded slowly, signaling his tentative agreement to initiate the legal transfer. Preston offered a faint, triumphant smile. He gestured to a silver ice bucket resting on the credenza. He pulled out a bottle of vintage crystal champagne, filling 2 fluted glasses. He handed one to Gerald. They raised their glasses in the center of the room, proposing a morbid toast to the future of the enterprise. They were drinking to my engineered death, celebrating their successful theft of $1 billion empire. They brought the crystal rims to their lips. The electronic lock on the heavy frosted glass doors chimed a sharp green tone. The pneumatic hinges hissed as the doors slid open, breaking the quiet atmosphere of the executive sanctuary. Preston paused, the champagne flute hovering inches from his mouth. Gerald turned around, his manufactured grief evaporating instantly. I stepped into the boardroom. I did not arrive in a wheelchair. I did not wear a pale hospital gown or lean on a medical cane. I wore a razor-sharp charcoal designer suit, cut with precise geometric lines. The fabric draped flawlessly over my shoulders, projecting cold, unyielding authority. My posture was rigid, my stride measured and silent against the plush carpet. The 7 senior partners gasped, standing up from their leather chairs in unison. The lead voting partner dropped his pen, staring at me as if a ghost had just walked out of the elevator shaft. I stopped 10 feet from the head of the table. I raised my hand and gripped the edge of the thick surgical gauze taped over my right eye. I ripped the adhesive away in a single swift motion, pulling the bandage off my face. The skin around my orbital bone was bruised a deep mottled purple, but the eye beneath was open, alert, and focused entirely on the 2 men standing near the podium. I dropped the bloody gauze onto the pristine mahogany surface. Preston's fingers went numb. The expensive crystal flute slipped from his grip, shattering against the hardwood floor. The pale champagne pooled around his polished leather shoes. "You look disappointed, Preston." I noted, my voice carrying a lethal surgical calm. "Did the hospital fail to call you with the autopsy report? Or did your hired orderly forget to send a confirmation text before Marcus shattered his wrist?" Gerald staggered backward, his knees hitting the edge of a chair. The color drained from his face, leaving a hollow, sickly hue. He realized the assassin had failed. He knew the federal authorities possessed the digital burner phone, tracking the blood money directly back to his wife. Preston scrambled to salvage his position. His breathing grew shallow, but he clung to his corporate arrogance. He slammed his fist against the podium, pointing a trembling finger at the senior partners. He shouted that my sudden appearance proved my mental instability. He demanded the board proceed with the incapacity vote, claiming I was suffering from post-traumatic delirium and posing an active threat to the financial security of the firm. I did not argue with his desperate fiction. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and withdrew a black encrypted access card. "The incapacity clause requires verified medical documentation," I explained, stepping toward the center of the room. "You brought a bottle of champagne to a corporate coup, but you forgot the legal foundation. You possess zero authority in this building." I tapped the black card against the central terminal on the mahogany table. The digital projection screen flickered. The corporate bylaws vanished, replaced by a flashing red lockdown notification. The system automatically severed Preston from the network. His executive login was erased. His biometric access to the vault was denied. Preston lunged forward, attempting to grab the terminal override switch. He never reached it. Marcus walked through the open glass doors, his presence filling the room with heavy, unyielding gravity. But my brother-in-law did not come alone. He led a specialized tactical unit, wearing dark windbreakers bearing the stark yellow lettering of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Flanking them were 3 armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The federal operatives bypassed the stunned board members and marched directly toward the head of the table. "Preston Vance," Marcus announced, his deep voice commanding total submission. "Your temporary supervised release is officially revoked." Attempting to seize control of a regulated financial institution while under active investigation for wire fraud triggers a hostile takeover mandate under the Patriot Act. Preston backed away from the podium, his chest heaving. He looked at the floor-to-ceiling windows, searching for an exit that did not exist. The engineered perfection of the biotech executive crumbled into raw, pathetic panic. He raised his hands in a futile gesture of surrender. The lead FBI agent grabbed Preston by the shoulder, spinning him around and driving him face-first onto the polished mahogany table. The sharp metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs echoed through the silent boardroom. They secured his wrists right at the chairman's seat, pinning him against the wood, while the remaining agents secured the perimeter. I stood at the edge of the table, watching the federal officers strip away his remaining dignity. I leaned forward, resting my hands near his shattered champagne glass, ensuring my voice was the only sound he heard. "Your access is permanently denied," I whispered. The spectacular collapse of the boardroom coup sent immediate shockwaves through the Manhattan financial district, but the machinery of the federal justice system never pauses to admire a corporate victory. By 3:00 that same afternoon, the theater of war shifted from the glass-enclosed executive heights to a windowless preliminary hearing chamber inside the federal courthouse. Julian sat at the heavy oak defense table wearing the standard khaki jumpsuit of a pretrial detainee. His custom-tailored cashmere wardrobe was a distant memory. His arrogant smirk had faded entirely, replaced by the frantic darting eyes of a cornered predator. He had spent the morning in a holding cell, listening to the decrypted audio recordings of Preston plotting his murder. He knew his former partner was currently being processed and fingerprinted just down the hall. He knew the Internal Revenue Service had frozen every liquid domestic and offshore account bearing our family name. Julian was facing a mandatory minimum of 30 years for his role in the biochemical assassination attempt. His only remaining hope of avoiding a concrete cell was securing a high-priced shadow defense team to untangle the federal charges. But elite legal syndicates require multi-million-dollar retainers paid up front. With his parents destitute and his own trust fund seized by the federal dragnet, Julian possessed zero capital. A predator stripped of its fangs and backed into a corner will always attempt a desperate final strike. His court-appointed public defender, a weary man carrying a stack of overloaded case files, stood before the federal magistrate. But Julian had not brought a standard criminal defense strategy to this bail arraignment. He brought a civil real estate maneuver designed to steal my home and weaponize the proceeds for his own survival. The public defender cleared his throat, presenting a thick leather-bound legal binder to the court clerk. He informed the judge that his client was invoking an emergency asset liquidation protocol. Julian was submitting a binding commercial mortgage contract to the official court record. The document claimed that my primary residence, a Manhattan penthouse valued at $20 million, was not actually my exclusive, unencumbered property. According to the printed paperwork, I had secretly leveraged the luxury apartment as collateral against a vast undocumented loan borrowed directly from the private retirement trust managed by Gerald and Caroline. Julian sat up straighter in his wooden chair, projecting a false air of fiduciary responsibility. He claimed that, given my recent head trauma and the volatile state of my corporate leadership, the family trust was officially calling in the debt. He demanded the magistrate issue an immediate judicial lien against the penthouse, authorizing a swift foreclosure and asset seizure. His strategy was breathtaking in its sheer audacity. He intended to legally evict me from my own home, liquidate the property through a shadow holding company, and funnel the $20 million into his legal defense fund, all while sitting in handcuffs for attempting to murder me with a titanium micro-injector. He turned in his chair, looking back at the gallery, where I sat beside Marcus. Julian offered a hollow, trembling imitation of his old, arrogant grin. He genuinely believed he had found a brilliant legal loophole. He thought a complex, high-stakes financial dispute would force the federal court to halt the criminal proceedings and untangle the real estate mess, granting him the crucial time and capital he needed to arrange transport out of the jurisdiction. I did not show a fraction of anger. I did not stand up and shout objections about the forged document. When an opponent builds a house of cards, you do not waste energy blowing on it. You wait for them to finish stacking the deck, and then you pull the foundation out from underneath them. Marcus stood up from the wooden gallery pew. He smoothed the lapel of his dark tailored suit and walked past the wooden partition separating the spectators from the legal floor. He did not raise his voice or engage in a heated debate with the exhausted public defender. Marcus operated strictly in the realm of raw digital fact. He approached the prosecution table and requested formal permission from the magistrate to submit an immediate piece of exculpatory technical evidence regarding the disputed real estate asset. The federal judge leaned forward, peering over his reading glasses, intrigued by the presence of the former cyber crime agent. He granted the motion with a swift nod. Marcus walked over to the digital evidence podium stationed in the center of the courtroom. He withdrew a sleek, encrypted flash drive from his pocket and inserted it into the universal serial bus port. The heavy projector, suspended from the ceiling, hummed to life, casting a bright, rectangular glow against the white wall directly behind the witness stand. Marcus did not display the text of the mortgage agreement. He did not care about the legal phrasing, the interest rates, or the formal paragraphs detailing the foreclosure terms. He displayed the digital anatomy of the signature page. He explained to the silent courtroom that modern high-value real estate contracts rely heavily on electronic signatures to expedite corporate transactions. A digital signature is not merely a typed name on a screen. It is a complex, cryptographic handshake. When a party signs a digital document, the software embeds a permanent, invisible layer of metadata into the foundational code of the file. This metadata records the precise global positioning coordinates, the network routing address, and the exact millisecond the digital ink dries. Marcus tapped a key on the podium, highlighting a dense block of alphanumeric code projected on the wall. He translated the raw data for the judge with lethal surgical precision. He revealed the origin point of the electronic signature on the $20 million mortgage contract. The network protocol did not originate from a commercial law firm in Manhattan. It did not originate from my corporate headquarters or my secure personal devices. The Internet protocol address tied directly to a private residential server. Marcus zoomed in on the geographic coordinates, extracting the physical location of the router. The server was located in the climate-controlled wine cellar beneath the Fairfield estate owned by Gerald and Caroline. Julian had used his parents' secure network to forge my signature, assuming the private firewall would mask his digital footprint and hide the deception. Julian stopped grinning. The blood drained from his face, leaving a sickly gray pallor. His hands gripped the edge of the defense table, his knuckles turning stark white against the dark wood. But Marcus was not finished. He executed the final, devastating strike. He opened a secondary file on the flash drive, projecting a verified travel manifest acquired directly from the Department of Homeland Security Border Control database. Marcus pointed at the cryptographic timestamp embedded in the forged signature. He then pointed at the matching date and time-stamped on my official passport records. At the exact moment the digital signature was executed from a wine cellar in Connecticut, I was sitting in a closed-door corporate acquisition meeting in London. The flight logs, the immigration stamps, and the international hotel receipts provided an unbreakable geographical alibi. I was 3,000 miles away across the Atlantic Ocean when the contract was allegedly signed. The exhausted public defender looked at the projector screen and then looked down at his client. He realized Julian had just used him to submit a fabricated legal document to a federal judge during an active criminal hearing. The lawyer stepped away from the defense table, severing his proximity to the toxic legal fallout. The federal magistrate removed his reading glasses, staring down at Julian with a gaze devoid of any judicial mercy. Presenting a falsified real estate contract to steal a $20 million asset is a severe financial crime. But executing that forgery by stealing the identity of a living victim and submitting it into the federal court record elevates the offense to a distinct and devastating category. The judge struck his wooden gavel against the sounding block, the sharp crack echoing through the tense chamber. He dismissed the civil asset petition instantly. He then instructed the federal prosecutor to amend the active criminal indictment. Julian was no longer just facing charges for a failed biochemical assassination. The digital trap he set to steal my penthouse had just snapped shut on his own neck, adding the unyielding weight of aggravated identity theft to his pending federal trial. The federal magistrate did not show a shred of leniency following the forged mortgage debacle. He set a staggering cash bond knowing Julian lacked the liquid capital to pay it. But predators facing decades in a concrete cell possess a dangerous survival instinct. Julian leveraged the final remnant of his elite social network, securing a high-risk shadow loan from a predatory bail bondsman just hours before the court clerk closed the registry. The magistrate granted his release, but mandated a strict house arrest protocol, outfitting Julian with a heavy reinforced GPS tracking monitor locked around his right ankle. The court gave him 24 hours to surrender his passport and confine himself to his luxury apartment pending the formal grand jury arraignment. Julian returned to his apartment, but he had zero intention of waiting for the federal marshals to escort him to a penitentiary. He sat on the edge of his designer sofa, the ambient light of the city bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He rolled up the cuff of his trousers, staring at the blinking green light of the ankle monitor. The device represented the crushing weight of the American justice system. He reached onto the glass coffee table and picked up a heavy pair of industrial bolt cutters he had purchased through a discreet courier earlier that afternoon. With a sharp intake of breath, Julian positioned the steel jaws over the thick polymer band. He pressed down with all his remaining strength. The reinforced strap fractured with a sharp mechanical snap. The green indicator light flickered and died. He stepped out of the severed constraint, rubbing his bruised skin. He had just committed a secondary felony, instantly voiding his bail and issuing an automatic arrest warrant. The clock was ticking. Julian moved quickly through his dark apartment. He ignored his expensive wardrobe, his custom watches, and his rare art collection. He walked directly to a hidden wall safe concealed behind a modern painting. He punched in the biometric code, retrieving a single object. It was not a stack of cash or a fake passport. It was a sleek, metallic USB drive, a cryptographic cold wallet. Months before Preston was handcuffed to a mahogany boardroom table, the biotech executive had orchestrated a financial contingency plan. Preston understood the volatile nature of corporate espionage and assassination plots. He had quietly funneled $5 million in untraceable cryptocurrency into this specific offline ledger, handing Julian the access keys as a safeguard. Julian gripped the cold metal drive, feeling a sudden rush of arrogant triumph. He believed this hidden digital fortune was his ultimate salvation. He packed a single leather duffel bag, pulled the hood of a dark jacket over his head, and slipped out through the service elevator, bypassing the lobby security cameras. An hour later, Julian sat behind the wheel of an unmarked rental sedan, driving north through the driving rain. His destination was Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, a premier hub for private aviation, serving the New York financial elite. He had contacted a shadow aviation broker on the dark web, booking a seat on a private Gulfstream jet scheduled to depart for a remote jurisdiction in Eastern Europe. The destination country possessed 0 extradition treaties with the United States. Once the aircraft cleared international airspace, Julian would be an untouchable ghost living out his days in quiet luxury, fueled by the $5 million crypto reserve. He pulled the sedan onto a deserted access road bordering the edge of the Teterboro tarmac. Through the rain-slicked windshield, he could see the sleek white fuselage of the Gulfstream idling on the runway, its anti-collision lights pulsing a steady rhythm in the dark. Freedom was less than 100 yards away. Julian opened his laptop, resting it on the steering wheel. He inserted the metallic USB drive into the port. He needed to transfer the $5 million to the aviation broker international escrow account to authorize the pilot to lower the boarding stairs. He typed in the complex alphanumeric decryption sequence, his fingers moving with frantic, desperate energy. The screen illuminated, displaying the staggering balance of digital coin. He entered the destination routing code. He took a deep breath, savoring the feeling of outsmarting the federal government, the cybercrime divisions, and his own sister. He pressed the execute key. The transaction initiated the progress bar crawling across the screen as the funds moved from the cold ledger to the decentralized global exchange. 15 miles away across the Hudson River, the secure server room inside my Manhattan penthouse remained a hub of unyielding digital surveillance. Marcus sat in his ergonomic chair, surrounded by the soft glow of high-definition monitors. He held a cup of black coffee, watching the lines of code cascade down the primary screen. The system chimed a sharp, distinct tone. Marcus did not jump out of his chair. He did not rush to call the police or alert the airport security tower. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, watching the cryptographic handshake register on the global blockchain ledger. He turned toward me. I stood near the doorway, observing the operation with clinical detachment. He took the bait. Marcus announced, his deep voice resonating with precise, calculated satisfaction. Julian believed he had executed a brilliant, undetected escape. He assumed his encrypted cold wallet was invisible to our internal security audits. He failed to comprehend the fundamental architecture of a digital honeypot. Marcus had discovered the hidden ledger days ago while dissecting Preston corporate communications. But Marcus did not seize the funds or lock the firewall. He intentionally left a structural loophole wide open, baiting the trap. Marcus explained the psychological mechanics of the operation. If we reported the cold wallet to the authorities, the government would simply confiscate the asset, adding a minor financial penalty to Julian pending trial. But if Julian attempted to move the money across international borders while fleeing an active federal warrant, he would commit a Tier 1 global financial crime. We needed him to act on his own greed. We needed him to pull the trigger. Marcus typed a sequence of commands into his terminal. He was not trying to stop the transfer. He was attaching a proprietary tracking algorithm to the digital currency riding the wave of the transaction as it hit the international exchange. Julian sat in his dark sedan watching the progress bar hit 90%. He smiled, gripping the steering wheel. On the penthouse monitors, Marcus executed the final phase of the digital strike. He peeled back the encrypted layers of the $5 million, exposing the original source code of the currency. The blockchain is a permanent, unalterable public ledger. Every single coin carries a digital memory of its previous transactions. Marcus routed the transaction history directly into the Federal Intelligence Database. The origin of those specific digital coins did not trace back to a legitimate corporate bonus or a standard real estate sale. Preston had funded that cold wallet using the exact same dark web syndicates he utilized to acquire the biochemical weapon components. The currency bore the digital stain of unregistered synthetic peptides, black market medical equipment, and domestic assassination plots. The moment Julian pushed that tainted money onto a public international exchange to pay a shadow aviation broker, he tripped a global wire. The progress bar on Julian's laptop froze at 99%. Julian frowned, tapping the screen. He hit the refresh button. The interface remained locked. He looked up at the Gulfstream jet idling on the runway. The boarding stairs remained retracted. The pilot was not receiving the payment. A red warning banner flashed across his laptop screen, overriding the exchange interface. Julian read the text, his blood turning to ice. The error message did not cite a network failure or a localized server timeout. It displayed a formal banking code utilized exclusively by international regulatory agencies. Inside the penthouse, Marcus watched the global security network react with breathtaking speed. The automated algorithms governing the international banking system flagged the transaction instantly. Moving funds tied to the procurement of lethal biological agents to charter an untraceable international flight triggers the highest level of global alert. The system classified the $5 million transfer as an active attempt to finance global terror operations. Marcus leaned back in his chair, watching the final confirmation roll across his screen. The Department of Homeland Security database synced with the international grid. Julian was no longer classified as a white-collar fugitive, skipping bail on a domestic identity theft charge. By attempting to wash bioterrorism funds through an offshore aviation broker, he had elevated his threat level to the apex of the international watch list. The database generated a stark red notification confirming the issuance of a red notice. Interpol had formally activated a global warrant. Julian was now an internationally designated terror financier. Every allied intelligence agency, border patrol unit, and financial institution on the planet was hunting him. Julian sat in the rental car staring at the frozen red screen. The anti-collision lights of the Gulfstream jet suddenly cut out, plunging the tarmac into darkness. The pilot had received the Interpol alert and killed the engines, refusing to transport a designated international target. Sirens began to wail in the distance, echoing across the wet concrete of the New Jersey airfield. The trap was absolute, and there was nowhere left to run. The wail of police sirens echoing across the wet concrete of the New Jersey airfield shattered the quiet isolation of the private tarmac. Julian sat in the driver's seat of the rental sedan, staring at the frozen red banking code on his laptop screen. The Gulfstream jet, idling less than 100 yards away, had just cut its primary engines, plunging the sleek white fuselage into darkness. The boarding stairs began a slow hydraulic whine, folding upward to seal the aircraft. Any rational human being facing an active global terror alert and an approaching fleet of law enforcement vehicles would have raised their hands and surrendered. But Julian was not rational. He was a product of unyielding privilege, a man conditioned to believe that wealth could bend reality to his will. He refused to accept defeat. He slammed the laptop shut, grabbed his leather duffel bag, and kicked the car door open. Julian sprinted across the rain-slicked tarmac, his expensive designer sneakers sliding against the oily asphalt. The freezing rain soaked through his dark jacket, but the adrenaline pumping through his veins masked the cold. He reached the side of the aircraft just as the hydraulic stairs lifted, waist-high. He threw the heavy duffel bag into the cabin, vaulting over the rising metal gap. He hauled his body into the pressurized fuselage, ignoring the startled shout of the lone flight attendant standing near the galley. He pushed past her, marching directly into the main cabin. The interior of the Gulfstream was a sanctuary of elite luxury, featuring plush cream-colored leather seating, polished walnut paneling, and soft ambient lighting running off the auxiliary power unit. Julian threw himself into a wide swivel chair facing the cockpit. His chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath. Through the open cockpit door, he saw the pilot staring at the digital avionics display. The red Interpol alert flashed across the communication screen, illuminating the tight, confined space. Julian ignored the warning. He reached toward the custom-built wet bar bolted to the cabin bulkhead. His hands shook as he pulled a bottle of vintage Bordeaux from the rack. He grabbed a crystal glass, uncorking the wine and pouring a generous measure. "Start the engines," Julian ordered, his voice cracking as he tried to project an aura of total authority. "The money is buffering in the escrow account. It will clear the blockchain in 5 minutes. I will double your flight fee in physical cash the moment we touch down. Just get this plane in the air." He brought the crystal glass to his lips, taking a deep swallow of the dark red wine. The alcohol burned its way down his throat, providing a fleeting artificial warmth. For a single suspended second, sitting in the lavish leather chair, tasting the expensive vintage, Julian allowed himself to believe he had won. He told himself the sirens outside were responding to a perimeter breach on the cargo side of the airport. He convinced himself the pilot would obey the promise of doubled capital. He thought he had outrun the federal indictments, the biochemical assassination charges, and the wrath of his own sister. The delusion shattered before he could take a second sip. A blinding white light erupted through the oval cabin windows, eradicating the soft ambient glow of the luxury interior. The illumination was so intense, it cast sharp, distinct shadows against the walnut paneling. Julian dropped the wine glass. The crystal shattered against the carpet, sending dark red stains spreading across the pristine fibers. He raised his hands to shield his eyes, peering through the rain-streaked glass. 3 armored tactical vehicles painted in matte black had silently surrounded the Gulfstream, blocking the landing gear and the nose wheel. High-intensity halogen floodlights mounted on the roofs of the Bearcats painted the aircraft in a stark, inescapable glare. A mechanized voice boomed over a heavy exterior loudspeaker, vibrating against the metal hull of the jet. The command was sharp and unyielding, ordering the pilot to lower the stairs and surrender the cabin. The pilot did not hesitate. He hit the hydraulic release switch. The boarding stairs descended, hitting the wet tarmac with a heavy metallic thud. Julian scrambled backward, tripping over his own duffel bag. He retreated toward the rear of the cabin, pressing his spine against the lavatory door. There was nowhere left to run. The heavy thud of tactical boots marching up the metal stairs echoed through the narrow space. A specialized strike team of federal air marshals and local SWAT operators breached the threshold. They did not move like standard patrol officers. They flooded the aisle with coordinated, terrifying speed, wearing heavy ballistic vests and carrying compact tactical rifles. Laser sights cut through the cabin air, painting a dozen red dots directly onto Julian's chest. "Get on the ground!" the lead operator roared, closing the distance in 3 rapid strides. Julian froze his mind short, circuiting under the overwhelming show of lethal force. He did not drop to his knees fast enough. The operator grabbed Julian by the collar of his soaked jacket, executing a brutal kinetic takedown. He swept Julian off his feet, driving him hard into the floor of the cabin. Julian face smashed into the plush carpet, right next to the puddle of spilled Bordeaux and shattered crystal. The heavy knee of the tactical officer pressed between his shoulder blades, pinning him to the floorboards with crushing weight. Julian let out a sharp, breathless gasp as his arms were wrenched behind his back. The cold bite of steel handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists, locking tight. The federal agents did not treat him like a white-collar financial suspect. They treated him like a designated international terror operative, possessing access to biological weapons. They patted him down roughly, stripping him of his encrypted phone, his passport, and his wallet. The lead agent hauled Julian upright, dragging him out of the luxurious cabin and forcing him down the wet metal stairs. The freezing rain lashed against his face as they marched him toward the waiting armored vehicles. A senior investigator from the Department of Homeland Security stood near the open doors of the Bearcat, holding a waterproof tablet. He looked at Julian, reading the formal charges. The investigator stated that attempting to launder funds tied to domestic bioterrorism across international borders carried an automatic federal terrorism enhancement. He informed Julian that he was no longer heading to a standard holding cell. He was being transported to a secure federal black site for extensive interrogation. The word terrorism broke the final fragile pillar of Julian's sanity. The arrogant trust fund heir, who had laughed while bearing a titanium weapon in my face, dissolved into a sobbing, pathetic shell. His knees buckled, forcing the two armed marshals to hold him upright. The reality of spending the rest of his natural life in a subterranean concrete box, stripped of his name and his rights, crushed his mind. He looked frantically at the senior investigator, tears mixing with the rain streaming down his cheeks. He realized loyalty to his family was a death sentence. "I did not want to do it," Julian screamed, his voice cracking over the roar of the idling armored vehicles. He thrashed against the grip of the federal marshals, desperate to trade any piece of information for a shred of leniency. "It was not my idea. I am not a terrorist. You have to believe me." The investigator remained silent, waiting for the break. "They made me do it," Julian wailed, nodding his head frantically toward the direction of the city. "My parents, Gerald and Caroline. They planned the whole thing. They found the insurance policy. They told Preston to get the chemical. I was just the delivery method. They forced me to push that cake into her face." The investigator raised an eyebrow, noting the confession on his digital audio recorder. He asked Julian why a wealthy, aristocratic family would orchestrate a biochemical hit on their own daughter. Julian choked on a sob, the darkest secret of the family finally spilling onto the wet tarmac. "Because they are broke," Julian screamed, his chest heaving with raw, unfiltered panic. "The hedge fund acquisitions. The offshore tax evasion that was just the surface. 2 years ago, Gerald borrowed capital from a shadow equity firm in Miami to cover his margin calls. He did not know the firm was a front for an underground money laundering syndicate. They lost the investment. My parents owe a cartel $15 million. The federal agents surrounding Julian fell silent, processing the staggering scope of the revelation. The syndicate gave them a deadline. Julian continued weeping openly, now his pride entirely eradicated. The deadline was the end of this month. If Gerald did not deliver the $15 million, the cartel promised to butcher the entire family. They threatened to burn the Fairfield estate to the ground with us inside it. We had no liquid assets left. The only way to pay the blood debt and save our own lives was to trigger the $50 million key person insurance policy on Charmaine. We had to kill her. We had to sacrifice her to pay the cartel. The rotten aristocratic facade was officially pulverized. The refined country club elites, the polished shipping magnates, they were nothing more than desperate hostages to a criminal underworld, willing to execute their own flesh and blood to settle a debt. The senior investigator tapped the screen of his tablet, securing the audio file. He signaled to the marshals. They threw Julian into the back of the armored vehicle, slamming the heavy steel doors shut, locking him in total darkness as the convoy accelerated away from the runway, leaving the empty private jet sitting idle in the rain. Word of a federal tarmac interception travels through the criminal underworld faster than any official police bulletin. The shadow bail bondsman who had fronted the Capitol for Julian received the automated alert the moment the Interpol red notice triggered. He immediately placed a secure call to the Fairfield estate. Gerald answered the encrypted line in his sprawling mahogany study. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. The bondsman informed my father that his son was in federal custody, being transported to a black site, and that Julian had surrendered the Miami syndicate connection on a recorded line to the Department of Homeland Security. The phone slipped from Gerald's fingers, clattering against the polished hardwood floor. The aristocratic illusion that had sustained the Vance family for 3 generations evaporated in that single breathless moment. Gerald and Caroline were no longer elite shipping magnates navigating a temporary public relations crisis. They were exposed assets in a cartel money laundering operation. The federal government knew about the $15 million blood debt. The authorities knew about the staged assassination attempt designed to trigger the insurance payout. Warrants were already being drafted. Federal raid teams were mobilizing. Caroline did not weep. She did not collapse onto the imported leather sofa in a fit of despair. The cold, calculated survival instinct that allowed her to hire a dark web assassin in a hospital parking garage took immediate control. She moved through the study with frantic kinetic energy, pulling the heavy velvet drapes shut across the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Burn everything," Caroline ordered, her voice sharp and devoid of any maternal warmth. Every ledger, every drive, every trace of the Miami firm. Gerald snapped out of his paralysis. He rushed to the grand stone fireplace dominating the eastern wall of the study. He tossed the decorative birch logs aside and ignited the pilot light. He ran to the hidden floor safe concealed beneath a Persian rug, spinning the biometric dial with trembling hands. He extracted the physical architecture of their treason. He pulled out thick leather-bound accounting ledgers, documenting a decade of illicit wire transfers. He grabbed the encrypted external hard drives containing the digital correspondence with the Miami cartel. He gathered the burner laptops used to communicate with Preston and the dark web fixers. Caroline carried a heavy red steel canister of premium unleaded gasoline retrieved from the estate utility garage. She unscrewed the cap, the sharp chemical fumes instantly overwhelming the scent of old money and expensive cigars. Gerald hurled the ledgers, the laptops, and the hard drives into the stone hearth. He did not care about the structural damage to his luxury home. He only cared about erasing the paper trail before the FBI breached the front gates. Caroline tipped the heavy canister, pouring the gasoline directly over the pile of electronics and paper. The fuel soaked into the leather bindings and pooled around the plastic casings of the hard drives. Gerald struck a long wooden match against the stone mantle. He tossed it into the hearth. The accelerant ignited with a deafening hollow whoosh. A wall of intense orange flame erupted upward, roaring into the brick chimney. The heat was immediate and punishing, pushing Gerald and Caroline backward. The fire consumed the paper ledgers in seconds, turning the financial history of the syndicate into curling black ash. The plastic casings of the laptops began to melt and warp, the internal lithium batteries hissing as the extreme temperature compromised their cells. Thick, acrid black smoke poured from the fireplace, staining the pristine limestone mantel. Gerald stood watching the inferno, his chest heaving. He wiped the sweat from his forehead. The panic in his eyes was slowly replaced by a dark, desperate triumph. He believed he had won. He adhered to an antiquated criminal mindset, believing that fire was the ultimate equalizer, the one force capable of erasing any sin. He thought the federal agents would arrive to find nothing but meaningless, charred debris. A low, rhythmic vibration began to rattle the crystal decanters resting on the study credenza. The vibration escalated into a deafening mechanical roar. The heavy velvet drapes covering the windows illuminated from the outside, glowing with a blinding, intense white light. A twin-engine tactical helicopter hovered mere feet above the manicured lawn of the Fairfield estate, its heavy rotor wash flattening the expensive landscaping. The downward-facing pursuit spotlight pierced the gaps in the curtains, flooding the smoke-filled study with a stark, unyielding glare. Before Gerald could react to the aerial assault, the heavy reinforced glass doors leading from the patio to the study buckled. Marcus did not bother knocking or presenting a search warrant at the front gate. He led the FBI hostage rescue team directly through the rear perimeter. He swung a heavy tactical sledgehammer, driving the hardened steel head directly into the center of the reinforced glass pane. The structural integrity of the door failed instantly. The glass spiderwebbed and shattered inward, raining thousands of jagged shards across the Persian rug. 6 tactical agents flooded into the study through the breached frame. The beams of their mounted laser sights cut through the thick black smoke, painting distinct red dots across the chests of my parents. The operators moved with flawless, synchronized precision, securing the perimeter and demanding compliance. Gerald raised his hands, stepping away from the blazing hearth, but he did not cower. The patriarch of the fallen dynasty looked at the heavily armed agents and let out a harsh, arrogant laugh. Caroline adjusted the belt of her silk robe, offering a smug, condescending smile to the tactical team. She looked at Marcus, standing amidst the shattered glass, holding his federal tablet. "You are too late," Caroline taunted, her voice echoing over the crackle of the fire and the roar of the helicopter outside. "You brought an army to seize a pile of ashes. There is nothing left. No hard drives. No routing numbers. No proof. You can arrest us for arson, but you will never tie us to Julian or your imaginary cartel." Gerald pointed a manicured finger at the fireplace. The laptops were reduced to unrecognizable puddles of slag. The ledgers were carbon dust. The external hard drives were glowing red-hot. The internal metal platters baking in the extreme heat. "We beat you," Gerald sneered, his aristocratic arrogance flaring one final time. "Get out of my house." Marcus lowered the tactical sledgehammer, resting the heavy steel head on the floorboards. He did not yell. He did not show a fraction of frustration or anger. He looked at the blazing fire and then locked his dark eyes onto my parents. His expression was a mask of cold, clinical pity. He raised his left hand, signaling toward the shattered patio doors. A secondary unit stepped into the study. They did not carry assault rifles or tactical shields. They wore heavy thermal protective gear, carrying specialized aluminum containment units lined with cryogenic foam. They were the elite digital forensics recovery team from Quantico. "Fire destroys paper," Marcus stated, his deep voice slicing through the arrogance of the room. "Fire destroys plastic casings and melts logic boards. But you are operating under a severe technological deficit, Gerald. You think you live in a mafia movie from the 1980s? You do not understand the physics of modern digital architecture." Marcus stepped closer to the hearth, the intense heat reflecting off his stern features. "The data on those external hard drives is not written on the plastic," Marcus explained, delivering a flawless technical execution. "It is written on the internal metallic platters, using microscopic magnetic alignments. Heat alters the physical state of the metal, but it does not erase the magnetic memory of the binary code." The lead forensic technician approached the fire, holding a pair of elongated thermal tongs. He reached directly into the flames, extracting the glowing, charred remnants of the hard drive platters. He placed the searing metal carefully into the cryogenic containment unit, sealing the lid to preserve the current molecular state. "We do not need to plug your hard drive into a computer," Marcus continued, watching the color drain from Gerald's face. "The federal laboratory utilizes spectroscopic data recovery. We place these charred metal discs under a magnetic force microscope. We map the microscopic thermal deviations on the surface of the ash. We reconstruct the ones and zeros directly from the damaged alloy." Caroline's smile vanished. Her hands began to tremble. "By tomorrow morning," Marcus promised, "the algorithm will translate that burned metal back into crisp, high-definition text. We will have every single encrypted email you sent to the Miami syndicate. We will have the digital receipts for the $100,000 you handed to a dark web assassin. We will have the blueprints of your entire treason." Gerald staggered backward, hitting the edge of his heavy mahogany desk. His legs gave out. He slid down the wood paneling, collapsing onto the floor among the shattered glass. The fire crackled in the hearth, no longer a shield of destruction, but a monument to his profound failure. He had burned his own house down just to hand the FBI the exact physical evidence they needed. The lead federal agent stepped forward, retrieving a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. He looked down at the broken patriarch and the terrified matriarch. "Gerald and Caroline Vance," the agent announced, his voice carrying the unyielding weight of the United States Justice Department. "You are under arrest. The charges include conspiracy to commit murder, interstate wire fraud, and terror financing." The agent hauled Gerald to his feet, securing his wrists behind his back. "But those are just the predicate offenses," Marcus added, turning his back on the smoking fireplace. "Because you coordinated these crimes to service a debt to a recognized criminal syndicate, the Department of Justice is invoking the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act." The mention of the RICO statute sealed their fate. It was the ultimate legal weapon designed to dismantle mob bosses and international syndicates. It carried mandatory asset forfeiture and decades of consecutive prison time without the possibility of parole. Gerald and Caroline were not just going to jail. They were going to be buried alive inside the federal prison system, their legacy erased, their wealth seized, and their names reduced to a cautionary tale of boundless greed. The heavy mahogany doors of the federal courthouse swung shut, sealing the fate of a fallen dynasty. The gallery was packed to maximum capacity, but the air held a suffocating, heavy silence. The elite socialites, the shipping magnates, the country club board members who used to drink vintage champagne with my parents now sat rigid and mute on the wooden pews. They did not come to offer support or post bail. They came to distance themselves. They came to witness a public execution. The Vance family was no longer a pillar of Northeastern high society. They were a toxic contagion, a cautionary tale of boundless greed and spectacular failure. The federal judge sat behind the elevated wooden bench, a stern, unyielding figure preparing to deliver the final mathematical equations of justice. Preston stood first. The tailored charcoal suits and platinum watches were gone, replaced by the drab olive uniform of a federal inmate. His engineered corporate perfection had decayed during his months in pretrial detention. His hair lacked its usual precise styling. His shoulders slumped, bearing the undeniable weight of the forensic evidence. The prosecution had presented the decrypted audio files provided by his secret mistress, the forged insurance contracts, and the origin logs of the synthetic peptide stolen from his own laboratories. His defense attorney, a man who once charged premium rates to fabricate plausible deniability, did not even attempt a closing argument. The lawyer simply stood with his head bowed, pleading for a sliver of judicial mercy based on a prior clean criminal record. The judge showed zero mercy. He looked down at the disgraced biotech executive and summarized the sheer, calculated malice required to orchestrate the murder of a future spouse for a $50 million payout. For the orchestration of premeditated murder, corporate espionage, and federal wire fraud, Preston received a sentence of 25 years. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block. A quarter of a century in a maximum security penitentiary. The ambitious chief executive, who once commanded international boardrooms and manipulated market shares, would spend the prime decades of his life confined to a concrete cell. Preston's legs gave out. Two federal marshals had to grip his arms to keep him standing, his pristine public image reduced to the trembling reality of a convicted felon. Next, the tactical officers brought Gerald and Caroline forward. The sight of my parents sent a collective physical shudder through the gallery. The formidable matriarch who once dictated exclusive charity gala guest lists, and the arrogant patriarch who leveraged millions over afternoon golf games, now shuffled toward the defense table in matching state-issued jumpsuits. Their wrists and ankles were bound by heavy steel transport chains, the metal links clinking sharply against the polished marble floor. The spectroscopic data recovery, executed by the federal laboratory from the ashes of their fireplace, had yielded a flawless high-definition map of their treason. The reconstructed external hard drives provided the prosecution with decades of offshore banking ledgers and direct encrypted correspondence with the Miami money laundering syndicate. The recovered digital footprint also included the indisputable receipts for the blood money Caroline handed to a dark web assassin in a hospital parking garage. The federal prosecutor formally invoked the Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act. The judge did not hesitate to drop the hammer. He ratified the total civil asset forfeiture mandate. The sprawling Fairfield estate, the luxury imported vehicles, the offshore Cayman trusts, and the hidden digital cryptocurrency wallets were permanently seized by the United States Treasury. Every single asset bearing the Vance name was designated for government auction. They were officially destitute, stripped of the very wealth they had killed to protect. But the financial ruin was merely the prologue to the penal reality. The RICO statute carries devastating non-negotiable minimums. The judge addressed my parents, detailing their willingness to sacrifice their own flesh and blood to settle a criminal syndicate debt. He handed down consecutive life sentences. They would never walk on manicured lawns, attend a polo match, or sip imported wine again. They would die behind thick steel bars, their aristocratic dreams pulverized into dust. Gerald stared blankly at the polished wooden table, his mind fracturing under the weight of permanent confinement. Caroline closed her eyes. silent tears carving deep tracks through the wrinkles on her face, knowing the wealthy friends watching from the gallery would erase her from their memories before the court adjourned. Finally, Julian was forced to stand before the bench. The youngest Vance, the arrogant trust fund heir, who treated life like an endless credit limit, trembled visibly as the judge reviewed his specific charges. The biometric tracking evidence, the cloud surveillance footage from the commercial bakery, and the global terror alert triggered by his frantic digital transfer formed an inescapable steel trap around his neck. The judge looked down at my brother, noting the reckless deployment of an experimental dissolving biological weapon in a crowded civilian space. That single action, pushing a pneumatic titanium cylinder into a birthday cake in a public country club, triggered the severe domestic terrorism enhancement. The sentence was unyielding. 30 years in a federal supermax facility without the slightest possibility of early parole. Julian collapsed back into his wooden chair, the air rushing from his lungs in a sharp, agonizing gasp. He would enter the harsh, brutal ecosystem of the federal prison system as a young man and leave as an elderly, forgotten ghost stripped of his youth and his freedom. The bailiffs secured the perimeter and began the process of clearing the courtroom. They moved down the line, hauling the prisoners from the defense table toward the secure side exit leading to the transport buses. Their path led directly past the plaintiff table, where I sat beside Marcus. I wore a crisp navy suit, my posture straight, the physical bruising on my face long healed, leaving only a faint surgical scar near my right eye. As the tactical agents guided Julian past my chair, my brother halted. He planted his cheap canvas prison shoes against the marble floor, resisting the forward pull of the heavy steel chains. He looked down at me, his eyes red-swollen and devoid of the arrogant smirk that had defined his entire existence. The reality of his 30-year sentence had broken his spirit entirely. He offered a desperate, trembling apology, his voice a pathetic, cracked whisper echoing in the quiet room. He begged for a forgiveness he did not earn, pleading for me to recognize the sibling bond he had willingly tried to sever for a payout. I did not offer a verbal response. I did not grant him the satisfaction of my anger, my grief, or my pity. I maintained a cold, steady gaze. I reached into the interior breast pocket of my tailored blazer. I extracted a crisp, high-resolution printed photograph. It was a still frame pulled directly from his own deleted cell phone video, recovered by Marcus during the digital sweep. The image captured the exact fraction of a second Julian smashed the heavy cake into my face, his teeth bared in a cruel laugh, the white frosting smeared with my bright red blood. I stood up, invading his personal space. I reached out and slipped the glossy paper into the breast pocket of his khaki prison uniform, patting the rough fabric to ensure it sat securely over his racing heart. I leaned forward, keeping my tone low, steady, and sharp as a scalpel. "I hope they serve cake in there," I whispered. The federal agents did not allow the standoff to continue. They yanked his heavy chains, pulling him forward with brutal efficiency. Julian let out a hollow, devastated sob that echoed down the long marble corridor. The heavy wooden doors closed behind him with a final resonant thud, sealing his fate and crushing his final shred of pride into absolute nothingness. 6 months vanish with breathtaking speed when you are dismantling a corrupt legacy and replacing it with a titanium foundation. The sprawling Fairfield estate in Connecticut no longer belongs to the Vance family. Following the federal convictions and the immediate civil asset forfeiture, the United States Treasury seized the property to recover the cartel debts and the decades of unpaid taxes. The government placed the mansion on the auction block, expecting a prolonged bidding war among real estate developers. Instead, my hedge fund purchased the deed entirely in cash for a fraction of its original market value. I did not buy the architectural masterpiece to live in it or to sell it for a quick profit. I bought it to rewrite its entire purpose and erase the toxic history clinging to its walls. The high wrought iron gates that once kept the arrogant elite isolated from the real world now remain wide open. The estate serves as the primary operational headquarters for a charitable foundation I established. We provide secure housing, legal representation, and financial rehabilitation for survivors of domestic abuse and corporate extortion. The Grand Mahogany study, where Gerald and Caroline desperately tried to burn their digital ledgers, is now a bright, open counseling center filled with natural light. The thick smoke stains on the limestone hearth were scrubbed clean, replacing the memory of their frantic panic with a quiet, productive peace. The climate-controlled wine cellar where Julian sat in the dark and forged my electronic signature is currently repurposed as a secure server room. It houses the encrypted data and protective identities of the women we shield from dangerous partners. Even Caroline's expansive walk-in closet, once filled with imported silk and designer handbags, now functions as a professional wardrobe center, outfitting survivors for their job interviews. The aristocratic fortress built on lies and stolen capital has been systematically stripped of its pretension and weaponized for good. While the estate thrives under its new mandate, the people who once claimed it as their impenetrable kingdom are rotting in separate corners of the federal penal system. The Department of Justice ensures that co-conspirators involved in organized syndicate crimes are never allowed to communicate. The geography of their punishment is calculated, deliberate, and absolute. Gerald occupies a sterile concrete enclosure at a high-security penitentiary in Indiana. The patriarch who once commanded corporate boardrooms and exclusive country club lounges now spends 23 hours a day staring at a heavy steel door. His only human interaction is the mechanical voice of a correctional officer sliding a tray of flavorless state-issued food through a narrow slot. The aristocratic pride that defined his existence has evaporated, leaving a hollow, broken old man who flinches at the sound of heavy boots in the corridor. Caroline sits in a federal correctional institution in Alabama, thousands of miles away from the manicured lawns and luxury boutiques she worshipped. She trades her remaining shred of dignity for basic commissary items. The vanity that drove her to hire a dark web assassin is crushed daily by harsh fluorescent lights, scratchy cotton uniforms, and the total absence of mirrors. Her desperate letters appealing to her former elite friends are returned to sender unread and unopened. She is a permanent ghost to the high society that once revered her. Preston resides in a medium security facility in Pennsylvania. The disgraced biotech executive works in the prison laundry, folding coarse cotton sheets in a sweltering windowless room. His brilliant analytical mind is trapped in a monotonous cycle of grueling physical labor. He watches the financial news on a mounted television in the crowded common area, knowing the corporate world moved on without a single moment of hesitation. The industry he tried to conquer erased his name from their records the day he was handcuffed to my mahogany table. Julian faces the harshest reality inside a Supermax facility in Colorado. The arrogant trust fund heir, who relied on his charm and his parents' wealth, possesses zero leverage in an unforgiving ecosystem governed by raw survival. He wears the exact same khaki uniform every single day. The photograph I placed in his pocket was confiscated during intake processing, leaving him with nothing but the haunting memory of his own failure. He wakes up every morning to the sound of steel bars locking into place, knowing he has 30 years to think about the slice of cake that cost him his entire existence. The contrast between their concrete cells and my current reality provides the ultimate return on investment. The evening air inside my Manhattan penthouse is cool and perfectly regulated. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows offer an unobstructed panoramic view of the glittering city skyline. The chaotic noise of the streets below cannot penetrate the thick, soundproof glass. I stand near the edge of the expansive living room, holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne. The pale liquid catches the ambient light of the room, serving as a quiet testament to the battles fought and won. Marcus walks into the room, bringing the crisp, electrified energy of the financial district with him. He loosens the collar of his dark, tailored suit after a long day of navigating complex corporate legalities. He walks over to the wet bar, pours a glass of champagne, and joins me near the window. He does not carry a tactical weapon or an encrypted federal tablet today. He carries victory. The Regulatory Oversight Committee cleared the final acquisition parameters this afternoon. Marcus announces, his deep voice resonating with calm satisfaction. We officially own Vanguard Therapeutics. The board of directors signed the transfer protocols an hour ago. I nod, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my drink. When the FBI arrested Preston for domestic bioterrorism, the stock value of his biotechnology firm plummeted into a freefall. The remaining board of directors panicked as federal agents raided their laboratories and seized their private research files. Vulnerable companies scrambling for stability present the perfect target for a hostile takeover. My hedge fund swooped in buying the distressed assets while our competitors hesitated out of fear. We absorbed their infrastructure, their patents, and their entire research division for pennies on the dollar. We did not just acquire a company. We repurposed their sins. The experimental synthetic peptide Preston stole to induce a fatal heart attack is no longer an unregistered, untraceable weapon. My new executive board fired the corrupt scientists and hired a team of ethical researchers. We are currently stripping the peptide down to its base molecular structure, running strict compliant clinical trials under the direct supervision of the Food and Drug Administration. We are engineering the compound to target and heal damaged cardiovascular tissue instead of destroying it. We took their lethal assassination plot and turned it into a highly profitable, life-saving medical patent. I look out over the sprawling grid of light and steel stretching toward the horizon. Society pushes a dangerous, deeply flawed narrative about family and obligation. We are conditioned to believe that sharing genetic material creates an unbreakable bond, requiring us to endure endless manipulation, financial drain, and emotional degradation. We are told to forgive the unforgivable simply because we share a bloodline. But bloodline is not a protective shield. It is often a dagger hidden up a sleeve waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When the individuals who share your last name use that biological connection to cover up a cruel, calculated plot, the only way to survive is to sever the tie entirely. You cannot negotiate with predators who view your life as a disposable financial asset. You must crush their entire kingdom, leaving zero room for retaliation. Loyalty is earned through action and respect, not dictated by a genetic lottery. I raise my free hand and lightly touch the skin near my right eye. The severe physical trauma from the titanium micro-injector is gone. The surgical scar has faded into a thin, pale line, barely visible under the warm, elegant lighting of the penthouse. It serves as a quiet, permanent reminder of the price of blind trust and the necessity of ruthless self-preservation. The enemies who tried to destroy me are buried alive under the weight of their own staggering arrogance, locked in federal cages they can never escape. Their voices are silenced forever. Their wealth belongs to the victims they tried to exploit. And the empire I built from the ashes of their betrayal is only just beginning to shine. I turn away from the panoramic glass of my penthouse, leaving the glittering Manhattan skyline to the night. The war is officially closed. The quiet atmosphere in my home does not stem from isolation. It is a pristine, fiercely guarded peace. I constructed a thriving stronghold from the very soil my relatives mocked, burying their arrogance in the process. Looking back at the wreckage of their fabricated dynasty, 3 distinct principles emerge from the ashes of that family courtroom. First, biology is merely a genetic coincidence, not a binding contract. Society conditions us to endure mistreatment under the guise of familial duty, urging us to keep the peace at all costs. We are taught to forgive the unforgivable simply because we share a bloodline. But true loyalty must be earned, never assumed. When the individuals who share your last name view you as nothing more than a disposable resource to fund their delusions, severing that tie is not an act of betrayal. It is a vital, necessary amputation required to save your own future. You owe zero allegiance to people who actively plot your demise. Second, silence serves as the most lethal instrument in any confrontation. When faced with overt hostility or extortion, human instinct urges you to scream, to demand an apology, or to vigorously defend your worth. I chose the exact opposite approach. I offered them absolute silence. I watched them submit their forged signatures and present their fake tears to a federal judge. Let arrogant adversaries speak. Let them boast and formulate their schemes. While they waste precious energy maintaining a fragile illusion, you gather the hard data. You map their financial vulnerabilities, secure the digital footprints, and strike only when the legal checkmate is mathematically guaranteed. The third and final truth is that genuine retribution does not require you to descend into the mud. You do not engage in petty emotional brawls with parasites. You outgrow the threat entirely. You build an enterprise so vast and impenetrable that their malicious attempts to ruin you barely register as a microscopic tremor against your foundation. My victory was not defined merely by placing fraudsters in federal holding cells or foreclosing on their mansions. It was defined by multiplying my net worth, seizing their market share, and securing a generational legacy they can never touch. They mistook my calm, measured demeanor for weakness. They assumed a woman dedicated to her corporate empire lacked the instinct to protect herself. They learned far too late that the most dangerous predator in the room is the one who never makes a single sound until the steel trap snaps shut. Have you ever encountered individuals who severely underestimated your intellect, only to watch them orchestrate their own spectacular downfall? Share your experiences in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to Silent Vengeance Stories for more narratives of calculated, uncompromising justice. Never let anyone dictate your value, and always remember your silence is your sharpest weapon.